Apparently there's a lot of other board meetings happening today, and somehow or other this is the room we got, so I hope you're not too uncomfortable, and we'll try and have a break later. Apologies, the only one is Alison Marsden, who unfortunately isn't very well, but otherwise everybody else is here. Importantly, I would very much like to welcome our newest authority member, Christine Watson. This is her first meeting. We are delighted that Christine has joined the board. We also are saying goodbye to Francis Ashcroft, who, as you know, has had to step down from the board. But Francis, I think, has agreed to stay on SCAC, so we will be keeping a contact with her, which is very nice. Welcome also to Roland Green, our lead reviewer for the Public Bodies Review, who is observing this meeting, and as always, our colleagues from the sponsor team. So I think Amy is online. Yeah, I can see her. Hi, Amy. And Steve Pugh is here in person. Another goodbye is that this is Richard's last meeting, and we want to say goodbye to him and thank him for everything. And I think Peter will be embarrassing him in an appropriate way later on.
Possibly an inappropriate.
As usual, in the interest of transparency, this meeting is being recorded, and the recording will be placed on the HFEA website. Also, because this room is very small, you will notice that a number of members of staff are not present in the room when they would normally be. They're all online, and as needed for presentations, people will be coming in and out because there's not enough room to put everybody in here. Declarations of interest. So, Jason first, let's see.
Person responsible in a licensed centre.
Thank you, Tim.
Person responsible in a licensed centre, Tim Child.
Thank you. Geeta?
I'm here. A license holder and clinician in licensed centre.
Right, and Alison, yes.
Trustee for PET and for BFS.
Thank you very much. Okay, great. So first item on the agenda is minutes of the last meeting, which have been circulated to everybody. Any comments, or otherwise can I take them as approved? Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Most of the matters arising, let's get that, are quite a lot of them are being dealt with within the body of the meeting, but there were a couple that we just need to go through. So I think, the video for donor-conceived individuals, I think that is
part of our sort of general comms activity as we move towards OTR.
That's what I thought.
Claire and Rachel will be saying something about that later.
Fine. OTR and PGTM are all going to be discussed in the performance review. So let's leave that for now. The only thing I would like to do, I'm sorry if I'm sounding a bit headmistressy, there are a number of members who have not completed their training on cyber and other things. You will have probably received messages from Debbie to encourage you to do this, and you're now receiving a message from me to encourage you to do this. So you know who you are. Please, can you all complete that in the next couple of weeks? It would be very helpful. Thank you. Right. Moving on to the Chair's report, which is my report. Well, you've read it. I've had quite a busy time. As most of you will know, I'm going through, it's the appraisal season, and I am having meetings with everybody to do their appraisals, which I think is really more of a chat as much as anything to discuss how the past year has been and look forward to the future and to set objectives. And I think those have been, by and large, very, very positive meetings, and I'm grateful to everybody for their participation in them. As a sort of coming out of that or underpinning that, Peter and I had the HFEA Accountability Annual Review with the Department of Health and Social Care on last Friday. And that is our chance annually to talk to the departments about how we think we're doing, to hear from the department about any concerns they have, which we'll be pleased to know they don't have any, and really to highlight how we're performing against the business plan. So we go through the business plan highlights. We talked a bit about some of the issues to do with the storage regulations, new storage regulations which came into force last July, the last bits of bedding down PRISM, what we're doing to meet the challenges of opening the register, a few bits and pieces that have fallen out of the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Windsor Framework following Brexit, are obviously modernising the Act, all of these, and many of these things we'll be talking about a bit more, and also appointment of authority members, because there will be some members who are coming up for reappointment. We don't know whether they will be reappointed, but we have recommended that on the whole they are. So I think that was a very productive and positive meeting. That was followed by my appraisal, and the reason for mentioning that is because during that meeting I also have been invited to set objectives, and the objectives for the authority members will follow my objectives. Once those have been finalised, which hopefully will be in the next week or so, I'll circulate them to you, so we're sort of all aligned. And when we have our next away day, which will include continuing work on board effectiveness, which we've started last year, then we can talk about how we're measuring ourselves against those objectives. So altogether, it was quite intense, but very positive meeting. The other thing that I did, which I was very pleased to do, and I'm very grateful to Alison, who accompanied me, went to Scotland. We had quite a whistle-stop tour, top to bottom of the country. We started in Edinburgh, then we went to Glasgow, then we went to Dundee, and then we went up to Aberdeen, all in sort of under 48 hours. But it was a very positive couple of days, and very interesting because although we are the UK authority, so we regulate Scotland, so the funding is devolved. So the clinics we visited there were mainly NHS centres within hospitals, and which is a slightly different focus from down in England. And we were very well received, and I think we had some positive chats. Alison? Yeah,
I would agree. Very positive.
Great. And then apart from that, I've done, just some speaking. The most recent was on last Thursday night, which was a bit of a blur because I'd only just come back from the United States. But I was delighted because Ferring, the pharmaceutical company, sponsored a conference which was run by Scott Nelson, who is one of our SCAC members, and Stuart Lavery from UCH. And they asked me to give a keynote speech about the consultation and about legislative reform. I think it went well. There were lots of questions. And I would just mention, because I was very proud of this, that during the question time, and Rachel Cutting was there, a clinician from one of the clinics stood up and said, well, I'd like to make an observation, not ask a question. So my heart sank and I thought, whoops. But actually she said that in the last year she felt that the relationship with the regulator had got better and better, the inspection regime regime, our hybrid regime, was so much better. And she really felt that we were working together and that the regulation was working. And I was very proud of that and thought, well done, everybody. It was very nice to hear. So that was very positive. Yeah, and I think that's probably all I'm going to say. Yeah. Oh, one other thing, just to remind everybody that we did have the board effectiveness review at the half-year touch point, which was last meeting, and we're planning, an away day, as we did last year, to talk about sort of in more detail work we have to do, but also continuing that work in September. Peter.
Just questions for you.
Sorry?
Has anybody got any questions?
Has anybody got any questions? No? No, thank you.
Right, thanks very much, Julia. I've been out and about, as the paper suggests lately. I often try and visit clinics on an informal basis, if you like, not coinciding with inspection. So it becomes a different kind of conversation, and I've been doing a lot of that lately while we've been having the consultation on the potential reform of the Act, which Claire will lead a discussion later on. So I'm very grateful, put on record, for the time that people working in clinics up and down the country gave me the last few weeks. I always found it very useful to go. At the end of today, as you know, I'll also say something about Richard departing. I just wanted to give the board assurance that the process for appointing Richard's successor is well underway. We interviewed last week and have made an offer of appointment, which has been accepted. We're now going through the various reference processes. I'm delighted to say as well that our preferred candidate also chatted to Catherine earlier this week in her role as chair of AGC, and the candidate will be doing the same with the chair of the audit committee at the HTA. So when we've gone through all that, I hope to be able to make a formal public announcement pretty soon, and I'll obviously let the board know as soon as possible. There will inevitably be a small gap between Richard's departure in mid-June and the new person taking up post. This is almost always the case, and we'll just have to manage the gap. But I think we'll have processes in place that we can do that. So more on that to come. Last thing I wanted to mention at this stage, unless anyone's got any particular questions, is just to take a few minutes of your time to run before you some options we've got about strategy development. Now, you'll remember that we started a conversation, I think, at the last board meeting. We're in the final year of our 3-year strategy. So for Christine's benefit, the authority, as well as having an annual business plan, sets a 3-year strategy within which the business plan takes place, and this is the final year. That been delayed because of the disruption to COVID and so on. But given a whole series of changes in play at the moment, not least of which public bodies review and much else, there's an open question about the speed at which we continue with the strategy development work, or whether or not whether we should continue at the pace we've been going, or whether or not it might be sensible to sort of find sort of interim arrangements and extend that procedure a little. Now, we don't need to make a decision absolutely today, although if you're all of one mind, that's fine. But I think Paula's online. We were going to just give you a very short run through of the essential options. Is that a fair introduction, Paula?
Yes, absolutely. I'm sure you'll all remember the development process that we set out. As Peter said, there are just a few uncertainties at the moment, aren't there? So, for instance, we don't yet know how our Modernising the Act paper will land, and so we can't really read the rooms about that yet, and how big it would feature in the coming strategy. We don't know the outcomes of our public bodies review yet. And there's also the question of the future membership of the authority, because 7 of you, half, finish between January and July next year. We may or may not get renewals or extensions on some of those terms, but we could be looking at quite a refreshed authority this time next year. And so we would possibly have a sort of half new authority coming in just too late to have any say in the strategy if we went with the current timeline. So it's not a very easy time to work out what the timeline is. We're probably in a better position than we were when we went into COVID, when we just developed a strategy not knowing COVID was going to come along, and it somewhat disrupted the way of working we wanted to adopt, because we wanted to do lots of joint working with people in primary care, and all of that kind of stuff became impossible because of the pandemic and the period of time that this current strategy is occupied. So we are in a better position now, but I think we just need to look at the options, and we could do with a steer from you. So the options would be either to just carry on as planned, because we could do our best with the information we have, and if necessary we could loop around a bit later in the process and revisit or reprioritise it a bit at a later stage. That would have the advantage of us having a strategy ready when one is due, but it might be quite difficult until late in the process to incorporate all of the things that are currently unknowns. And that in turn would probably mean we'd end up consulting stakeholders at a very late stage. And I would also add that this year, as we know, with all the extra pressures and the discussions we've had before about prioritisation, the corporate bandwidth to think about all that, especially if it was in a very condensed time frame, is quite limited. But still, it's not impossible. Another option would be a 1-year extension. So we could delay developing the new strategy until we have a few more concrete pieces of information about key pieces of work, and retain at least the vision from the current strategy for an extra year. So that would give us more time for the unknowns to become knowns. And we could, of course, carry on meanwhile with some aspects of the current strategy. However, I would say that quite a lot has changed since that was launched in 2020, so that might feel a bit unsatisfying. That's the downside. The third option would be similar to that, but it would be to draw a line under the current strategy and simply have a gap while we develop a new one. We could continue the development we've started, but do it more slowly. And I think that would be excusable in this set of circumstances, although it's still not ideal. And we could potentially be perceived as lacking direction, perhaps. But like option 2, it has the advantage that it would give us more time, and we'd probably end up with a better strategy. So I'd be really interested to hear what you all think about that and what to do about this, the slight awkwardness of the timing. And I think I would then plan to bring you a paper to the July meeting, setting out where we've got to and setting out a new timeline based on the discussion today. So welcome any thoughts, really.
Thank you, Paula. That's very kind, and that's very clear. Comments, thoughts? Francis.
I can see why it would be tempting to consider at least a 1-year extension. You make the comment that a lot has changed and that might feel unsatisfactory. Is it possible to identify any particular part of the existing strategy which perhaps doesn't feel appropriate now, that we could then identify as something we deliberately set to one side, but without formally moving to the phase where we develop a complete new strategy that will take into account all the other uncertainties and unanswered questions at the moment?
I think it's not that the old strategy has gone out of date. It's more that there's so much in our landscape now that isn't in it. So, yeah, I suppose one possibility would be to have a kind of very short interim document stating what our priorities would be for the 1 year. That's a possible idea. And those priorities could include developing a 3-year strategy, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So, it's not that the old one is out of date as such. I would say that there's still stuff we can do across all of it, because it's got best care, right information, shaping the future. The concerns that went into that strategy, the subjects like add-ons and things like that we were talking about are still very much alive.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Not stale, is it?
Geeta.
And my question, Paula, thank you very much for that. Do we have anything like a guidance from DHSC about a timeline and by which time we have to produce a strategy in order to get our business plan or budget approved? Do we have any deadline like that? And if there is, then I suppose we'll have to meet the deadline. If not, strategy gap seems okay, knowing that there are other priorities now.
Perhaps I can answer that, Paula. The short answer is no, Gita, in the sense of what's vital is the annual business plan, because that's kind of absolutely related to the annual financial settlement. Different organisations take different views about strategy, whether they're 3-year, 5-year, etc. So that's more about, the good management of the organisation and giving it a sense of strategic direction and purpose. But it's not a formal accountability requirement in the way that the department do have to sign off on our business plan and an assessment from us of the extent to which the budget for that year, the plan is actually deliverable with the money.
Other comments? Questions? Catherine, are you?
Yes. I like the idea, Paula, of developing a concrete vision for what it is we're targeting if we were to go for the 1-year extension. I think it's important in terms of the tone as well as the content that we have a very clear public line on why we're delaying the implementation of a strategy that one might automatically expect to be delivered now-ish. And I think that we could use that to our advantage, not least because of the number of changes that are happening in the market and the number of, all that you've outlined to date, but also changes in the market and changes in fertility trends. So I like that idea. I wouldn't be in favour of a longer strategy gap. I think that would lay us open to the charge of lack of direction.
Yeah. Anyone else? Christine?
Yeah, I think I would be in support of number 2, because I think we do need a little bit more time, I guess, to develop a really good strategy. And it also gives time for other things to develop. I think the scientific landscape is advancing at pace. And I think having a little bit more time to incorporate some of these aspects perhaps might be worthwhile.
Yeah. Anyone else? And I would also say that, our current strategy, there's nothing within our current strategy that we wouldn't want to keep doing in some shape or form. And it's sufficiently generic to give us quite a lot of wriggle room, I think, while we develop other proposals. Because as you say, there's a lot happening. We've got OTR coming on stream later in the year. And, it gives us a really good opportunity to be very thoughtful about developing a new 3-year strategy. So I think. So is the general consensus that a 1-year extension as of option 2 really feels like the right way?
Yes.
Yeah. Paula, are you happy with that? Does the team feel that is the best option from your point of view?
I think so, yes, because if we do that, we can come up with a concrete articulation of what we would be doing with that year, which can then inform the business plan. And I can bring you a paper about that in July. And then we can continue on a slower burn doing the strategy development as and when it feels like the right time. So I'll maybe come up with a new timetable and run it past you first, Julia.
Yeah. Well, if you would do that, and why don't we sort of work together so that we've got a sort of little presentation for the authority in July with some timelines and what we propose to do and how the work will flow during the course of the year. I think that would be very helpful for everybody. And Paula, you can't see it, but I can see lots of nods around the table. So I think that feels like a good idea. Great. Thank you, Paula, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that right from you, Peter?
That's it. Unless anyone's got any questions.
No? Okay, great. Thank you. So now we have another of our standing items, which is the committee chairs report, where we ask the chairs briefly to report from those committees who have met since we last met. Now, Alison Marsden is unexpectedly sick. Graham, would you be able to just give us a short thing on Allison's committee?
Alison asked me to do so. You'll see from the paper that the Licence Committee, as you knew last time, I think, has been meeting with unusual frequency just lately, and the 29th of March meeting was indeed adjourned. So there's been quite a lot of complex matters before us. And as well as that, there's been an appeals committee hearing held on the 22nd of March. And if you want to read all that, it's all on the website. And you will also see there that the minutes of the meeting on the 4th of May have not yet been approved, although that's imminent. Once they're published, I'd recommend that members read them and the Appeals Committee minutes, because they will illustrate that as a result of what the Licence Committee has done, taking some pretty difficult decisions, 2 clinics where there was a long history of non-compliance have shown a quite remarkable and speedy turnaround. And I think that suggests that we've not been wasting our time, I'm pleased to say, in meeting so often and taking quite a few tricky decisions. It's quite a pleasing turnaround. It's not always pleasing that there's an appeals committee, but what's come out of it has been actually very good, I think.
Thank you. And I think, it is definitely worth minuting our thanks to the Licence Committee and to Graham in particular, who had to chair this particular hearing. It's been an enormous amount of work, well above what they normally do. And I think they've handled it really very well to a swift and very appropriate conclusion. So our thanks to all of you on that. Any questions for Graham on this? No, we've all been briefed as it happens, so I think we're up to speed. Jonathan on SAC.
Yes, thank you very much. You've got the broad outline of the statistics in the paperwork, and you'll see we've been pretty busy. Normally at authority meetings, I just say a few words to give people a flavour of what the meetings are like and a sense of what goes on. And I think one of the things that makes SAC a particularly challenging but also enjoyable and effective committee is that it draws on a wide range of expertise. So we've got clinical questions we need to address, scientific questions, we've got legal questions that we need to keep in focus, we have ethical questions which are at the forefront of our mind, and we draw on patient experience, particularly through the Genetic Alliance. I think one of the challenges for the committee is to bring all of these different areas of expertise to the very particular statutory question we're given. And I think we generally do that very well and have sort of learned from each other to explain things in ways that are effective. And so that gives you some insight into what we get up to.
Yeah, thank you. It's really helpful. And one of the questions that I raised with SAC members when I was doing the appraisals is, we have SAC meets every month, and there's a huge amount of paperwork because we look at some extremely complicated medical conditions. And we put in, as you remember, a sort of buddy system whereby people job shared. So instead of everybody coming to every meeting, half the people everybody came to 6 meetings a year, not 12. And as far as I can tell, and also speaking with Jonathan, that has actually worked well. People are also prepared to be flexible, for which I'm very grateful. But I think that's
I think that's right. It's meant that there's an even broader range of voices being heard in the committee, and certainly makes it more flexible for people to
Great. Good. Well, thank you. That's really helpful. Thanks. AGC did not meet yet, but we are external. As you're probably aware, we have 2 external members on AGC, usually chartered accountants. Our 2 terms of office. Their terms of office have come to an end, and so I'm going to ask Catherine just to talk a bit about the process for identifying new external members.
Yes, we're well on the way. We've shortlisted 5 excellent candidates, and we're interviewing them on the 1st and the 14th of June. Thankfully, it's a delegated decision, a decision for Julia to make the appointments, and therefore, once we've reached a decision as a panel, that will go ahead quite quickly. We're not required to replace like for like, so we're not required to replace 2 with 2. It may be that we only find that we want 1. It may be that actually the skill sets that we might identify as missing are all in one person. So we're not prejudging that. Julie is going to chair the panel. I'm obviously on the panel, and then we've invited the chair of the HTA Governance Committee to be the third member of the panel, which, in the light of our shared services, seems entirely appropriate, and it will be good to have his input. Interestingly, 3 of those that we've shortlisted hold a chartered accountant qualification, and 2 have a very different background, which may well bring advantage to ATC. So we're looking forward to those interviews.
We'll report back in July or maybe sooner by email when we've made those appointments. SCAC is not meeting till June, so you'll have a report on SCAC in the July meeting. The only thing I would say, and I just wanted to raise it now, is that unless you've been completely out of circulation for the last week or so, you will have noticed all the headlines about mitochondrial donation, that as a result of a Freedom of Information request to The Guardian, we have put out a statement on the basis that Newcastle, which is where the treatments take place, hope to publish information about their programme in a peer-reviewed journal, a high-impact scientific journal, shortly. These things always take a bit of time because journals take time to publish. As soon as that happens, then obviously SCAC will be reviewing that journal, which will be entirely appropriate for it to do so. Just wanted to mention that. I think Claire might mention it again in her report. Any comments or questions, Claire?
Sorry, Julia, just on SCAC. So SCAC was meant to meet in early June to review the existing add-ons to the new rating system, and then it would have reported back to the July meeting. At the last SCAC meeting in February, the committee made the decision to ask for more information to go into that review process before the committee meet to review the ratings, and that's taken a bit of time. So actually the June meeting has been postponed till the end of July.
Oh, okay.
So we won't be able to update authorities as a whole until
September. Okay, so we'll go to September. Well, this is so complicated, and we are gradually coming to a conclusion of it. So I think it's good that we've done that. Thank you for that. And presumably all the SCAC members know it and so on. Okay, maybe just make sure that Christine has that, because Christine will be joining SCAC, has those dates in her diary then. Yes, we did speak about it, but it's going to be okay. Right, now performance report. As members know, each meeting we consider a performance report, and we invite various directors to highlight key issues. What I think we'll do is what we always do, is that I'll invite different members to different directors to speak about different, and we'll take questions as we go on each little bit rather than at the end. So firstly, Peter, on HR and the dreaded PRISM.
Thanks very much, Julia. So on HR, you'll know for a long time we've particularly been concerned, I think, about turnover. Turnover continues to drop. It's now below our sort of 15% target for the first time in a long time, although only just below. That's clearly welcome. Clearly, with an expert organisation like ourselves, that can still be disruptive, particularly if turnover is in posts which require considerable induction and training and the like. So I'm very pleased with the general direction of turnover. It'd be nice if it was a bit lower, but it's not that it takes the pressure off the organisation. But certainly to be down a bit below 15 when not so long ago we were up above 20 is a marked improvement. On sickness, on the other hand, the figures are going in the opposite direction. Here, I don't think there's anything structural to worry about. If you look back over a longer trend, the sickness numbers are cyclical. Unsurprisingly, they're at their highest in the sort of coming out of winter bit with all the usual things. And in a small organisation like ours, those figures are really open to distortion when you get things like a couple of members of staff on long-term sick, which is where we are at the moment. So although the sickness numbers have gone up quite significantly, I don't think there's anything structural about this, and I expect them to return to the pattern where they're normally under the kind of public sector average. approach. So clearly, if they don't, I will be reporting to you at further meetings, but my judgment for the moment is there's nothing untoward about the sickness figures. On PRISM, you've got the essential stats in the papers, and as you know, AGC, we do a very detailed report to AGC at every meeting, and we'll be doing so at the next meeting. Where are we? We are now in a position where we've been for a while, which is all bar 3 clinics are now using PRISM. The 3 that aren't do so for a particular technical reason, and I'm hoping we will be resolving that soon, because that technical reason is, as I speak, being utilised with another clinic. This involves the significant shifting of data from one system to another, and we're currently trialling that new technical fix with another clinic that happens to be changing its patient records provider sort of midstream, so to speak, on the assumption that process works and works well. We can then apply it to the remaining 3 clinics because of the particular issue we had there. So I'm very much hopeful by the time the next AGC meeting is on, we will be saying that process of getting all of the clinics finally into and using PRISM is underway. The process itself shouldn't take too long. As for PRISM itself, it's working well. We've got something like approaching 400,000 units of activity. We've got an overall error rate of about 4%. For those clinics that use PRISM directly, it's significantly lower than that. Some of the third-party systems are a bit higher, which gets us to the overall 4%. And crucially, we're also making progress on 2 related elements. So if you remember, PRISM is the data submission system going into the new register, but we need to do 2 other things, one of which is build a system that allows us to interrogate the register for the purposes of opening the register requests, and you'll get a sort of overview of where we are in OTR more generally soon. But we had it in the plan that we started work on that this week, and in fact I think we were 2 days late, but we are there or thereabouts, so I'm very pleased with that. And the other element is updating the register data and validating as such that we can then update our Choose a Fertility Clinic function. That of course is the clinic level tool against which anyone can look at data on our website and look at performance at a clinic level. We are already doing a lot of work with clinics at the moment, and I'd like to pay tribute to the efforts of clinics who are dealing with backdated validations. So because we had to effectively pull a huge amount of data into the system in order to transfer it, inevitably that brought with it data with all sorts of minor errors in it, and we're now in that process of updating it. And we've gone out to a number of cycle errors to clinics, and they are steadily working their way through those. That's essential preparatory work for the final update of Kafka, which should be later this year, and I will be in a position again, I hope, by the time of the next AGC meeting. We've been saying for some time, once we've done this sort of work, we'll be able to give you a firm date on Kafka. I'm very hopeful that when we get to AGC, the next AGC meeting, that we will have some certainty about when things are about to happen. So I hope that's helpful at this stage. I'm very happy to take any questions before handing over to Rachel Francis.
Just a quick question. Could you just remind us, under the error rate of 4.1%, what sorts of errors are they in the data?
So what they're not are, what I would call as significant errors are things like, that we've actually got the outcomes wrong, or things like this. So in any patient record, if you like, or the information that we hold, there'll be a whole stack of information there about patient's name and address, certain proofs of identity, a whole bundle of other bits and pieces. And when we say errors, it could be any element of that sort of record. So what it's not are, if you like, missing treatments or wrong treatments. It's just an incomplete record. So the numbers always look, when we say we've got 8,000 errors, that sounds like quite a big deal. But it could be that, when we transferred data over, the postcode didn't sort of fit effectively the best way I can describe the way the technical people describe the data transfer process to me is a bit like sort of square pegs into round holes, and occasionally some of these minor bits of data don't quite fit the holes, and we need to go back and just double check with them. But what I can assure the board is, so what this isn't is the sort of data that would lead us to give misleading public information, either about success rates or trace down donor records and so on. So it's it's just sort of complicated fine print stuff, but it makes sense to try and get it all cleaned up, particularly now. And it's the sort of thing we do.
Thank you.
Alison.
Thanks, Peter. Just in the papers, there's a comment for finalising the new person ID structure for opening the register, and I don't know what the other phrase is, 10 FL?
Family limit.
10 family limit.
10 family.
Couldn't figure that one out.
Sorry.
Sorry.
It's a land of acronyms.
It's like that Dutch guy that had 500.
Yeah, so you'll remember, for the public record, it's long been the policy of the authority that broadly, there are always issues, aren't there, about consanguinity or even just the psychological issue about how many half-siblings it's reasonable for somebody to deal with. And the authority has long had a policy where it talks about a family limit of 10. Now, clearly, that could be as little as 10, or it could be, let's say, a typical maximum family size these days is probably about 3. So it could be as many as 30 half-siblings, but it's in that kind of territory. And I also should say, for the public record as well, on the whole, donor gametes are used for very much fewer than 10 families. So they're often in fact used for 1 or 2 at most. So on the whole, most people have relatively small numbers of half siblings, but in theory they could go up to a 10 family limit.
Gita.
Thank you, Peter. My question is about staff sickness.
Yes.
Because there are 16 employees being sick. So how is the sickness measured? Is it just somebody goes off for a day? Is it also included in that? And do you think they are coming from the same department? Is it affecting, the end-to-end licensing process and inspections, or is it all over the place in all departments?
From memory, and this is from memory, the pattern of sickness is across the organisation rather than. I can't remember, I must admit, what the precise threshold is of how many days it is before we take somebody being sick. But it is with the exception of a couple of people on long-term sick, this is overwhelmingly sort of winter coughs and colds of varying sorts, and it's pretty evenly distributed. I think I'm looking at both Claire and Rachel, given you manage the majority of staff, but that's my sense of it. So it is quite a steep increase, but and in fact, I did look back at previous years' figures, and there's a rather similar pattern. I think it is the endless coughs and colds of the current period, or the period we're reporting on.
Any other questions for Peter? My only comment really is that I'm delighted to see that finally the turnover numbers have started to go down, which is really very, very encouraging, and long may that continue. It's great. Rachel.
Apologies, we've got a problem with the slides, but all the papers the members have had all
yes.
They're also on our website, so in the slides would be the same thing that would be sent around in the paper.
Fine, we've all read the papers, and I had heard that there might be some technical issues in this room, so I apologise, but we'll do what we can. Rachel.
Thank you. There was just a couple of things from the performance report to highlight. One of them is in the graph, the inspection reports to committee. Just wanted to obviously say that some inspections are more complex than others and do need management reviews to be put in, which can delay the report going to committee. But the other thing just to highlight at the moment is that you probably can recall during COVID, we couldn't, obviously the restrictions on travel meant that we couldn't actually carry out some of our inspections. So we, although there's a legal requirement to attend a licensed premises every 2 years, we either extended licenses or didn't do some interim inspections. That now is having an impact on the number of inspections that we're having to fit in this year. and it coincided with the time of a couple of leavers, key members of staff leaving in the team, and maternity leave and sickness as well. So it does mean that there may be further delays in applications, and that KPI might be harder to achieve. However, on a positive side, we've made some very good recruitment, new recruits, and we've got a very strong field for the new scientific inspector that we're inspecting for next week. And as you can see, we do have months that are very busy. In March, we would have had 4 inspections, but because of targeted inspections, changes of premises, and inspections moving because of staff availability, clinics and inspectors, we were up to 12 inspections in March. We are going to talk about OTR a little bit later on. I'm delighted to say the team are very stable at the moment, and the training is nearly complete, which is good, and they're working hard at the moment on the case management system. They're about to start testing on that. It's been very positive we've had, which will actually help the efficiency and speed at which OTR applications can be sent out. So although there still remains many in the backlog to get out, we have now got a team that's fully trained, and improvements which will be coming over the month, as Peter said, with the tools in prison as well to extract the data from the register.
Thank you, Rachel. Any Alison?
Just a comment, really. Through the work in the Licence Committee, I've been struck by the amount of work the inspection team puts into some of the centres. So I think the actual number of inspections doesn't reflect the level of input that the inspection team have. And I don't know if there's any way to demonstrate that, but as I say, from the reports coming to the Licence Centre, we can see that some centres have an awful lot of input from the inspection team to support them to get to where they need to be. So I don't know if there's something we can pick up there, Rachel, just to demonstrate the amount of work the inspection team does, because I don't think that totally reflects it.
Yeah. And I certainly, from my experience, particularly not only the visits in Scotland, but also all the clinics that I've visited this year, of which there have been, a fair number, overwhelmingly the response is that the new hybrid inspection, where the paperwork is done online and the physical inspection is just about physical inspection and not running around trying to get papers, has been universally welcomed and liked, and people are feeling very positive about it. And one of the things I thought that maybe probably during the next year, or when we've got a bit more time, it's a new inspection, it's really a new way of doing it, and it's probably a good idea for us to review the process and just check in with it and get a little bit more of an understanding about it, particularly once the new inspection team is bedded in, and I think that's very positive. But as I say, overwhelmingly, I'm getting information from clinics which say they have a really good relationship with their inspector on the whole, and although they understand that the inspector is still very much looking out for what's in the clinic, and is a bit of the policeman, if you like, to some extent, the new model is working well. So Claire, that's Rachel, that's great, and we should take that back to the inspection team. Thank you. Claire.
Thank you. Just a few sort of highlights from me. So just looking ahead to some upcoming publications we've got over the next few months. In June, we're planning on publishing our annual fertility trends report, although this will be preliminary data because of some technical changes to our new register and the new prison system. This is unverified data, but it will be the first time since 2019 we're publishing those headline figures that people are used to seeing. Along with that, we will later in the year be publishing dashboards which will enable anyone who's accessing our website to be able to manipulate that data, looking at it by age, by fresh and frozen cycles, by ethnicity and other factors. We're hoping that will be a really exciting development, and more on that later on in the year. In the autumn, we'll publish our annual State of the Sector report, which is our annual review of what's happening in the sector, so annual figures on compliance, incidents, that sort of thing. And lastly, towards the end of the year, we'll be publishing an update to our ethnic disparities in fertility treatment report. Members will remember we first published this in March 2021. It was the first time we'd released that data and it had a big impact. We'd obviously like to see if anything's changed, but also use the opportunity of working with GITA and others like the RCOG to have a wider call for action on where we think there are some changes that could be made that would make a difference. So that's it in terms of reports. Members remember that earlier in the year we came with a Code of Practice update. This is largely as a result of the changes in storage from the Health and Social Care Act from last year. We're in the process of finalising that and going to the Secretary of State for sign-off. You'll remember that there were 2 or 3 outstanding actions. One was on an issue relating to posthumous use of embryos, and the others were a potential new professional body guidance and any impact of the Windsor framework on Northern Ireland clinics. We're still waiting on developments on those 3 things, but I think the commitment to publish this calendar year, which is what the authority agreed, still stands. The news on the Windsor framework, I think it's probably good from an administrator's point of view, is that the current view is that we won't need to make any changes to the Code of Practice as a result of the Windsor framework. So that's one development. Peter mentioned the news last week about mitochondrial donation treatment. Just to say, that obviously hit the headlines in a big way, and there were, by Wednesday afternoon, there were over 1,000 pieces of coverage, both nationally and internationally. We have someone who, not even their full-time job is to deal with press inquiries, so all credit that they managed to keep their head afloat. And I think the comment that Peter made at our statement was very widely reported. As others have mentioned, licensing activity continues to be very high. Again, as in other parts of the organisation, a small team and many people are working kind of above and beyond to keep that going, so thanks to them. And lastly, just a note about our social media. I know we report on some of this, and I know many of you follow us, particularly on LinkedIn and Instagram and Twitter, which are the kind of growing channels, Facebook less so. The infographics that, again, we have one person who does this, has been doing, I think, have reached a lot more people than previously. We've been getting lots of positive comments about them. And Julia actually did a video in advance of the constitutional law reform, which was very well received. And that's certainly something, as we talk about our work on OTR going forward, certainly something that we're going to be doing more of. So I think a particularly positive note in our communications, not only in mainstream media, but in social media as well.
And Claire, just you might want to say, I mean, it's specifically when we launched the consultation, because that was obviously after the last meeting, we had an enormous amount of interest, actually quite focused on donation, actually. But we had Woman's Hour interview on the Today programme, Peter, me, Claire, I think Tim did, a lot of interest, media interest. I don't know if there's, I couldn't have missed anything out, but that was good. Thank you. Comments for Claire or questions?
I just would like to congratulate the team because I see that there's such positive activity on social media, and a lot of the following has increased as well, which is extremely positive. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll pass that on.
Anything else? Okay, that's great. Richard.
Thank you. I know how much you would enjoy the finance update, so I'll keep it as brief as I can, although it will be my last one. So the year-end position for the HFEA is at the end of March. We have an interim financial position, which at the moment is a surplus against our income of £231,000. It represents about 3% of our total planned spend. So it's not bad when we try and be within 2% really of what we've set out to spend in year. As we've touched on, we had quite significant staff churn this year, which makes it difficult because that's a significant part of our cost. And also in relation, I think, on the income side, the reconciliation of the the estimate, invoice of the estimate we provided to a lot of clinics through 2020 unwound in 22, 23, because we actually reconciled the figures that were presented to us through the new PRISM system. That did result in a little more income than we'd had expected, because the reconciliations were slightly higher. So overall, I think we've done a good job in managing that. Obviously, it's an interim position. At year end, we do a bit more work to ensure that we accrue our costs correctly, so that figure will change slightly as we go through our audit. But I'm pretty confident we're there or thereabouts, and we won't find any significant changes. Just to mention, there are 2 red indicators in the report that relate to my area, both in relation to debt recovery, and again, they link back to the point around the reconciliation of invoices. So unsurprisingly, when clinics get much bigger bills from us, they're expecting, because of reconciled debt data, they query them more, and therefore they pay them later. So I hope you'll accept my explanation that primarily the increase in debtor days and the time it's taken us to recover the income from our licence fee payers has been just in ensuring them and providing the additional data and assurance that the estimates have been reconciled correctly and that they do really owe us the money. We never have any concerns. We do always get our money from our licence fee payers. There's very, very rarely any questions. But obviously, I think with the significant sums of money involved, it's quite right they question them, and understandable that they've been a bit slower in paying than they would normally be. But I'm sure for next year that we'll get back on track. Just to touch briefly on next year, so Peter has had a delegation to 12 with granting aid for 23-24. So now we have an income estimate position. There's ongoing discussions with the department around potential savings and efficiencies for this year and future years. They're ongoing. We don't feel they'll have a material impact on our financial outlook for 23-24. But just to make you aware of that, there could be some changes. But overall, I think we're in root health for next year. I don't really have anything else to add to that. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Richard. That's really very clear. Right, and this is really the last of what I would call the standing or the sort of more administrative areas that we have to deal with. And this is the on the strategic risk register. You've all read the papers. Over recent months, we've revised the strategic risk register, and the associated risk policies. The work has largely been driven by Catherine and the AGC, and I think I really would like to record our thanks to them, because this work really needed doing to make sure that the risk register is, up to date and very much reflects, and the accompanying policies reflect what our risks are, and they've done a lot of work on it. So thank you.
Can I in turn say thank you very much to Paula and Shabir, who have really done the work. I mean, we might have seen over it, they've done the work.
Absolutely. So today's discussion is really to have an early sight of the current strategic risks which are now in the new register, and then AGC will review the register in detail when it meets in June. So to help us with a discussion which will then ask us to really just note the risks and the new risk register, Shabir is going to just take us through the current register.
Okay, thank you. As Julie's mentioned, this is the new style register that's gone to AGC already, and there's many of the risks that you'll see on the register, which are in the papers. They are due for a more stringent review and updates, which are meant for June. So that'll be presented to AGC in June. There have been some minor updates to the risk register since it was presented last, but the majority of the updates will be done for June AGC. I can go through the whole thing section by section, unless if anyone's got any specific questions.
I was going to say, I think there's a couple. There's a number in there which I think are fairly standard,
yeah.
But I think there's a couple in there, Shabir, it might just be worth highlighting to the board.
I think the finance one, I think Richard's spoken about most of the issues within that. It's fairly straightforward. One of the other things that you'll notice that we won't have from the strategic risk register from onwards going are the closed ones we're going to remove from here to just make the report easier to be able to see and understand. The first key risk, I think that probably needs to be looked at is some of the information that we have around new risk, which is in here, if I can get to it, excuse me. Is on PRISM. So PRISM has been added as a specific strategic risk, along with quite a lot of the systems and development work that goes on along with PRISM, and some of the issues that have come through over the years with PRISM have impacted our functionality on some of the other systems that we use, Epicenter being one of the key critical ones. That's delayed some of the work, so we've put PRISM within the Strategic Risk Register. One of the actions that we've taken is a lot of the operational actions that we take with PRISM, Epicenter, and a lot of the IT functions that we have, they're all put down on our operational risk registers. So this is just a way for us to bring it up at a higher level, just to and note that it is something that we're looking at in quite a lot of detail. But this isn't presented in the Strategic Risk Register, but it is captured in our Operational Risk Register.
Yeah, so just to add to that then, what we're very keen to do is give you full transparency, if you like, about the impacts in terms of not just delivering something, but, because delivering something was really difficult and took a long time, it then has impacts on other things. And as you can imagine, an organisation of this size with limited, both the bulk of our expenditures on people, we have limited capacity to undertake significant IT work. We all know that PRISM has represented a huge, stretch of our capacity to do that. And what that has meant is, because it's now showing the benefits, it has taken longer, it has curtailed our ability to then do other updating work. And crucially amongst there is the one I will flag up here, but if it becomes problematic, you'll obviously be first to know. Epicenter effectively is the system we use to manage the workflow for inspections. It is old, it needs updating, and the diversion of key IT resource to PRISM has meant so that now becomes, so we're describing this, if you like, as it's almost like a collateral risk. PRISM will gradually, once the latter things move away, and we'll be left with, whatever the risks are around some of these collateral things. But we wanted to be, if you like, to operate a real open book system with you about this. So it's not about PRISM per se, it's about the impact of PRISM on other things we're trying to do. Early days yet, but we'll sort of develop this as it goes along. And I think that's where the old risk register, which was a bit static, didn't capture that kind of dynamism about its ongoing impacts on things.
Catherine, do you want to add anything?
No, I think Shabir and Peter have covered it all very well. The one observation that I'd make at the moment is that I think we need to be careful in our gauging of residual risk levels. So, for example, in the principal financial risk, but also the principal governance risk, both of which are very much tied to what we are bidding for in our arguments for legislative reform. I think that in stating that the financial risk is currently below tolerance, given the pressures that are outlined very clearly in the management commentary, actually that cannot be true, or at least it's premature to say that it's below tolerance, absent the June data on income. So I just query that. And similarly with the governance risk, we've said that that's currently at tolerance, and it seems to me that that probably cannot be at tolerance either, because we are so concerned about the effectiveness of our regulatory framework and whether or not that needs to change, and we're targeting the change and the impact of that after the delivery of the next strategy 26-27. So again, it would seem to me that probably we've got a current residual risk which is higher than our tolerance, which is why we've got it featuring high on the strategic risk register. So just a note of caution about that. And just to outline that the teams are always thinking below what's presented here of what are the current mitigations, but what are also the upcoming effective mitigations. And so when in the governance risk, we're talking about the risk of the paucity of powers making it more difficult for us to be agile as a regulator, I think it's really useful to know that we are continuously compiling those occasions and examples of where and when we felt we could have been more agile had we had additional powers.
Richard, do you want to say anything about our sort of general stance on living within the income we've got while recognising the kind of the pressures we're under?
Yeah, I think it's a point in terms of the income. We don't know where we'll be until the first quarter. I think we always, struggle with this risk. I think that we always had the levers within the organisation to ensure we never exceed the income. So when we talk about the financial risk, in many respects, what we're talking about is the implications of balancing the financial position and what that means for delivery and the potential impacts on making decisions that withdraw or reduce resources in the areas we'd like to prioritise. So I think when we look at this from a post-mitigation perspective, maybe what we're doing is over-considering the fact that we are absolutely confident we will not breach control totals because we have all those things in place. And we accept that where we pass that risk is operationally onto those teams that deliver, where we may be asking them to not do activity or to pause activity to ensure we do balance financial position. So I think it's a fair point. I think it's trying to get that clear across the whole spectrum of risk that, I suppose from my perspective, not sloping shoulders, the financial risk isn't one of exceeding budget, but one of the implications of me putting the levers to stop us overspending on the rest of the business.
One of the questions I had coming out of this, and it is just a question, is when we look at the risk, the new risk categories and the mitigations, what the risk is and the mitigations, are we mapping that against what the areas in the consultation process that as a result of changes to the Act, those risks will be mitigated? Because I think that's quite an interesting and important thing to do.
Not specifically, yes, because I think part of the issue is, so the difficulty is that we can clearly, and I hope we do demonstrate on a monthly basis, that we can regulate well in the interest of patients within the set of law we've got.
Absolutely.
Clearly, though, in all sorts of ways, which I don't need to rehearse in front of you, that existing framework and the market we're trying to regulate, that task is becoming harder.
Yes.
And we could do so in a way that is both more efficient and indeed, I would argue, better controls the risks with a different set of rules.
Yeah.
So what we're trying to do at one at the same time is account for our actions in a present day world and identify the gap between now and then, which would actually, both from an efficiency perspective and a risk perspective, get us all, and crucially patients, into a better place. Now, whether or not, because this is an early, we're still, if you like, learning to use this risk framework, whether we've quite captured that in the risks as they currently are, I think is something we will develop over the coming months, particularly in conversation with AGC. Yeah. So that's what we're trying to get at. Whether or not, as I say, we accurately articulate that at the moment is an open question, I guess.
I mean, you put it much better than me, but yes, I mean, that's sort of what I'm getting at, because obviously we haven't sort of maybe done it now, but going forward, assuming these are the regulatory changes we are looking to achieve, I think it will probably be helpful to map them against the risk range to show, because I can see areas, although we regulate very well now, I can see areas where risks might be mitigated as a result of legislative reform. Yeah. I mean, Catherine, are you happy to sort of consider that? I mean, lots of nodding, so I'm assuming we're on the right track. Anything else? Graham?
I mean, I'm grateful for the detail and all the work that lies behind this. There are rather a lot of numbers, and I don't know how you assess the risk of overcomplication in a risk register, but that's just a general comment. Two things is that I can see why the section on legal risks has been closed down and sort of moved to operational. And I think we are in a robust place if legal action is taken, and it might just be my recent experience, but it feels as if there's a sort of stepping up among those who would rather we didn't exist, a sort of intensification of that whole process of wanting to take legal action against us and in consultations to criticise us as a body. And that ought to be reflected somehow in the risk register, that I don't see it being reflected as a result of that section on legal action being closed, and it's not quite transferred to the operational one in the way I would have expected, I think. So that's just one comment. And then the third is, it says there's no technology risks, and I just wonder whether we're just perhaps a bit too narrow in our understanding of technology, because one of the areas of strategy this paper relates to is shaping the future, and there isn't any mention, and I can understand why there isn't, of AI in it, and yet AI's rapid development could affect the fertility sector in all sorts of ways that we can hardly anticipate, and I don't know who will ever undertake a credible assessment of the changes AI could bring to the sector and what sort of risks that involves, in a way for us, but also for the sector more generally.
I think they're good challenges, Graham, if I take them in reverse order. So I suppose what we've been trying to move away from in this risk register is, if you like, ever-present risks, which are, if you like, part of the landscape, but haven't reached either a particular pitch that such that they become a real threat, if you like, to how we go about our business or our reputation or safety of patients and so on. And I think the problem with some of the technology ones like AI is we know this is a coming issue. We and lots of other regulatory bodies. But those kind of issues have not yet taken specific shape such that one can actively mitigate against them. And in other, so for example, were there not broader public expenditure controls, we could decide to invest in AI expertise in the knowledge that actually this is going to be a growing thing, and it was a good thing if we generally got our head around that. Given the public expenditure world we're in at the moment, that would be all that would do is at the expense of the activity we need to deal with now. So there's a kind of, there's just a sort of issue there about all this horizon scanning stuff, about the extent to which at what point it takes form in a kind of risk register. And because I think of the conversations we'd had before with AGC about trying to make the register more agile, more ready to form new risks and close risks down and so on, it felt better to have something that was more active than something that was just set around a series of longer term risks. I don't think there's a straightforward right and wrong way here. I think you're right to identify a problem, and one of the downsides of a slightly more active model is that some of these longer, more stable things get lost. And again, maybe over time we'll get a better balance on that. It's a slightly similar issue on legal. I think we took the view that our previous legal risk was conceptualised along the lines of, this is a contentious and often contested area, and therefore we needed a kind of ongoing legal risk just to reflect that fact. But in fact, as you all know, that's a true statement. But actually, legal challenges fall into two sorts of categories broadly. Those are challenges against what I might call policy, and they are challenging against formal regulatory decisions. And the answer in part to both of these about the mitigations is to do whatever you're doing well, whether that's developing policy. And I cite the challenges we had recently to our add-ons policy, which were dismissed at the application stage, and largely dismissed because the judge thought that we were it was entirely within our remit to making policy that we did. And that secondly, we went about that policy in a justifiable way that would meet the normal tests for, a public body going about its business. So when we consulted, they were real consultations and so on and so forth. So in that sense, the way we make policy feels
well mitigated against. And similarly, and you will have had direct experience of this recently as well, I think our licensing processes, the way in which we inspect, the way in which we license, have been found to be good, robust processes in terms of the way in which public bodies should go about that activity. And it seems to us that the crucial distinction here is, having done all of that and having all those mitigations in place, that can never just stop legal action. If somebody is determined and has the money, they can take legal action whether or not they have a good chance of success or no chance of success. And if you like, the task for us, therefore, is to be as prepared as possible and to take decisions as well as possible, such that what we're mitigating, if you like, is not so much the likelihood of action, but crucially the likelihood of that action being successful. So having said all of that, there will be times when legal action is such that it is so large and all-encompassing that effectively, rather like with some of our other conversations, we end up in a place where it becomes a huge distraction to other activity. And I think where we've got to, and I'm not sure this is right, is that, if you like, where we can do something that we can mitigate against in terms of our processes, we haven't put it as a standing risk. However, were we to have a really significant legal challenge against us, or indeed a combination of at the same time, that effectively a great chunk of the senior management and many other people's time was spent dealing with the action, then really that's obviously reputationally difficult and all the rest of it. But crucially, it means we can't do all the other things we're supposed to do. So I think that's where we've come out. Now, again, I think there's a conversation for us over the coming months about whether that's the right place we've landed, or whether or not you think, if you like, from a licensing perspective, we're rather underplaying what can feel like quite a real risk. Sorry, that was rather long-winded, but does that help?
It does, yeah. I understand that completely, and of course it's what is the risk register for?
Yes.
is the crucial question.
Tim and then Alex.
Let's come back just to reassure you, actually. So AI was mentioned as part of the horizon scanning process of SCAC, actually. So we look at what changes and challenges, developments there might be that might affect the sector, and AI is right up there as one of them. So it has been considered and will continue to be considered and looked out for.
I was going to make a similar point to Tim on the AI, and I think, probably in 30 years ago, there was a discussion about how the internet is going to disrupt fertility regulation, and so there will be 90% of AI. We will have no concerns. If people are using AI to roster embryologists, we probably won't really care about that in the same way we don't really care what type of rostering software you guys use now. We will care when it's determining what's the best embryo to implant, and so on. So I think, just going to reiterate really what Tim said, that once that work is done out of SCAC, we can then bring specific strategic and operational risks for consideration onto the register. And I don't think you would have something as broad as AI, because, as I say, it just won't matter to us for most of what's going to be used.
Gudrun?
I was just going to add, or even the human genome for that matter. In 2000 we had the human genome, and look at the impact it's had. Yeah. It's astonishing. You could link a gene and take 10 years in 1988, and now you can do it in a day. So,
but also the cost is
tiny.
It's tiny. Yes.
Well, thank you. Firstly, yes, Shabir, Paula, and the team and AGC, thank you very much indeed for all your work on it. I think this is very much a living document that will come back to us time and again. I think for the moment we're just asked to note the latest edition of it, which we've done, we've read it. But as I say, particularly over the next year when there's a lot of change and so on, this has provided a really good bedrock foundation that we'll use to keep it live. This is the right time to have done all this work. So thank you very much, much appreciated. That's great. Yes, as always, Peter, you've read my mind, but it was in there. We were sort of going to have a quick break, but I think maybe we'll have the break a bit later because there's a lot to do. And now we've come to sort of the end of the what I call the standing items, the items that we look at very, very regularly. We're going to have an OTR, an opening the register, just an update on where we are. Claire and Rachel, and then we're going to have a discussion about some of the contact information that donor conceived people will be getting and how we do that, and that's going to be quite an important discussion for us. So let's start, and then I'll sort of ask you somewhere during these discussions if and when we want to break, or whether we just plow on. Great. So, Rachel and Claire, over to you.
Okay, just trying to remember who was going first. So thank you. So this is, members will all remember that at the end of last year, it was agreed that at every authority meeting during 2023, we would give an overview of where we were with activity leading to release of donor information from the autumn onwards. So this is the second or third of these updates. So our first update on sort of the headlines of activity since March. We'll review where we are with the 3 work streams and then talk about next steps. So there has been more activity, I think, from the present day to March than there was between March and January, if that makes sense. So there's a ramping up of interest, so continuing and significant media interest. We have said that especially from documentary companies, but I would say in addition, there's significant media interest. In addition, there's significant media interest from many documentary companies who are looking to do kind of following donor conceived individuals as they potentially find out who their donor is, etc. I'll talk a bit more about our call for donors to update their addresses as part of International Donor Conception Awareness Day. And we've also ramped up the engagement with our primary stakeholder groups, the Licensed Centres Panel and Patient Organisation Stakeholder Group, who we talked to about 2 of the 3 work streams in the last few weeks. The first on the future of the support services and also some of the more detailed communications planning. Rachel and Dania, who runs the OTR service, presented at the Donor Conception Network annual conference, and I think dealt with some very wide-ranging questions and got some very helpful feedback. And then Rachel will say a bit more about the kind of focus day looking at the operation of the system. And finally, there's a reference to the questions about updating donor contact details, which is the substantial second item we're going to discuss under this heading in a few minutes. So if we go to the next slide, Paula. So that's just a recap of the 3 work streams, and I think Rachel's going to talk about the one on the OTR service.
Yes, so just to pick...
Just keep on going.
Just to pick up on the operational side of the projects that we're doing, we've made very good progress on the new case management system, which is a Microsoft Dynamics system which will integrate all the different spreadsheets and the way that we manage the cases at the moment into one system. That's had very positive feedback from the team so far, and we're moving into the testing phase at the moment, so that is on track and going well. We've also continued the work on updating our policies and procedures. We had a dedicated day with the OTR team to finalise some of the letters and the procedure that will feed into the case management system, so it will become more an automated process. So we're continuing to work hard with that, and once the RETA tools, as I said earlier, it will make the process a lot more streamlined. And as Claire said, Daniel gave a very good presentation at Donor Conception Network annual conferences. It gave us a chance to talk to a lot of donor conceived individuals and parents, and obviously DCN, people that are involved in the organisation, and it was a very, very constructive day.
So if we move on to the next slide, which looks at the future of the support service.
Yeah. So the support service, the project is now very much underway and going well. We've presented the case to CMG, and the project has started, and what we've done already is we've started a literature review looking at the international comparisons of other models of support, which countries offer any support, which don't, and how that offer is made. We're also starting to look at how funding can be, how we can raise funds to support that service. As we know, the HFEA has funded that so far, but depending on the demand of the service, that's going to become something that is not going to be financially viable in the future. So part of that is exploring how that can be funded. We've got 2 stakeholder engagement groups, roundtables, that we're writing the briefing papers for at the moment, and they are at the beginning of June, and that will need to look at what support will be needed, whether it's counselling, whether it's more peer support, what will be useful, podcasts, information on websites to explore the different how support can be accessed. And then we were also writing a questionnaire which will be going out to donors and donor conceived individuals and hopefully recipient parents to gauge opinion there as well.
Okay, and then just moving on to the last 2 slides, just cover the communications work streams. As I said, we've been increasing activity with this, particularly in the call to action on the International Donor Conception Awareness Day. That resulted in over 200 pieces of coverage in national and regional media, but also on local radio, where the key message was to donors to update their contact details, and a kind of awareness raising that 18 years on, people might not kind of remember the details of that. So I think that was a kind of first stage of the start of that campaign, and we appreciate that many of our patient and professional organisations helped to spread the messaging there as well. In terms of particular activity that we're doing next, we'll be reviewing all our website information. We're looking, as it says on this slide and the next one, different ways of engagement, whether that's short videos on social media, Instagram Q&As, etc., as well as setting in a more formal sense in a series of clinic focus articles and on the clinic portal, kind of what happens next for clinics and what we expect to do in terms of managing OTR requests. I should say, sort of in a similar vein as, we could probably triple the size of the OTR team and still kind of not have enough staff. We could, the demand on the communications in this probably will far outweigh our resources, which is why I think targeted campaigns like we did last month with the donor awareness were very helpful. So the more we're able to execute that using third parties, whether it's the media or social media or other people, the more effective I think it will be. So I think that's the kind of end of the formal presentation, but happy to take questions or feedback.
Yeah, Francis.
Since I know it's very recent, but since you've been publicly inviting donors to let you know if they've moved, have any started to contact you and tell you yet?
I think it's too early to say. So that was only the 20. I actually kind of blank of the date. I think it was about 3 weeks ago.
Okay.
27th of April. Yeah.
And will they be contacting the centre where they gave the
potentially? So either the centre, or they could go through us, or they could decide that they particularly don't want their details to be updated. So it can also it could go the other way.
And then one other question, when donor-conceived individuals contact you to ask information about the donor, are they given a choice as to how they receive that information, whether it's by post, over the phone, email, or whatever?
Should we talk about that bit when we talk about the next?
Okay.
Yes, because that's going to be, I was going to say, it's the heart of the decision. So we'll come back to that. Jason.
Very simple question. You talked about exploring funding options. Have you explored any? What are they?
We will be bringing that back to a paper later on in the year. Obviously, there's different options about charging actual applicants for that, or whether they just charge for the actual service. But that will be sort of an options appraisal that will come back to authority later on.
Thank you.
Geeta and then Alex.
Thank you. Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Rachel. What happens if the clinic is closed?
We do have centres that are closed, and we know where the notes are being looked after in health, so we can go to sort of the hospital where that clinic was in to access notes from there. But we do make it clear on the website that if a donor's clinic is closed, they come directly to us and they can go on an online application to update their address directly with us.
And are you making a certain number of days for response? Are you setting out like within a certain number of days they will get a response?
We try to. At the moment it is taking a lot longer because of the demand. Certainly when we get the new systems in place, it will shorten that time.
Okay, thank you.
I know it's all under control, but I just thought we should probably call out, linked to the previous item, we should probably just call out cybersecurity as a risk for launch, because obviously most hacks are actually not targeted in this way, but the more publicity we do, the more someone knows we have a hackable database of however many people.
And we should, I think it is highlighted in the Strategic Risks Register, particularly about the OTR, but we should revisit that again before
it's a really good point. Yeah. It's there somewhere, but it's probably not there
we'll revisit
clearly
that.
enough.
So, as I think we all agreed, we bring OTR back at every board meeting because it is one of the most significant things that we are in the process of doing and will be doing over the next few months. And as I always ask, we're all kept up to date, but at this moment, Claire, Rachel, do you have any concerns, or do you feel we're on target, and generally things are going as you would expect them?
And I think the concerns are, as we've said, is that, we have increased the capacity of the OTR team, and we've got new systems which will make things more efficient, but demand will continue to exponentially grow, and it is quite easy to access some of the information through DNA testing websites. Obviously it's different than the register information, but those are commercial entities and they can be quite swift, and we run the risk of being slower than that, although our information is kind of direct from the source, if you like. So I think the demand exponentially increasing without us having the ability, unless we decide that that's all the authority is going to do, the HFEA is going to do. And I think on sort of more on the comms side, again, demand overwhelming. So, there's only so many different documentary companies that we can liaise with before it becomes kind of unsustainable, and then we're not actually doing the job of working with clinics to update our information and working directly with donors and donor-conceived individuals. I guess on the support service, I don't know if you want to say more about that one.
The support service, we've got to try and work out what support is required and what would be useful. We have obviously just commissioned a straight counselling service, but that might be the most useful model. So we've got to spend some time now talking to stakeholders, doing the questionnaire, putting all that together, and then reporting back to you. But then the risk is trying to find that model and then try and find a funding model for it, because we need to be able to raise some revenue for that.
Zena.
Sort of following on from that, Rachel. So as the post 2005 children turn 18 and slowly start getting their information this year, do we have any kind of system by which we can follow up what they've done with that information? Is there a kind of a channel of open reporting that we could even? I know we can't in any way mandate that, but is there a way that we could sort of say that it would be helpful for them to touch base with us in 6 months to let us know what's happening? Because at the moment we don't, as you've said, we don't know how many of them are going to use that information to actually seek out a relationship, or
we would know. We certainly would know if they access the counselling service at Hewitt. We would know that, but we wouldn't know what happened with that information. But again, that would be a resource implication for the team to do, and that's almost bordering on a research project rather than a function that the HFEA needs to do.
But then thinking ahead, is that a piece of research project that we want to think about maybe kind of commissioning?
The bottom line is it all requires money.
Yeah, no, I understand.
Gowdy said.
Yeah, and it may. It's not only interesting but also a very worthwhile piece of research once this has all been established and going. And it might be that, say, next year or the year after, or sometime in the future, somebody wants to do that project, and then we'd have some of the data, and then they would obviously have to go and do research in a normal way.
We have had some interest from researchers to answer that question that could work collaboratively with us.
Yeah, Alison.
Sorry, just to come back to the finance side, because you mentioned charging the donor conceived individual as an option, but I'm thinking about the adoption services where there's no charges are for people to find out about their adopted parents. And I know maybe not so much now, but the donor service was always kind of thought of a bit like the adoption service when we started out. And I just wonder if that's it's unpleasant to think that adopted people can find out through social services and there's an adoption agency, but we're in a very funny position with the HFE, and trying to get a parallel is maybe something to think about, because charging each donor conceived individual just doesn't seem to sit right. But I know it's an early days, and perhaps you're exploring
really early days, and this is what we've got to ask questions,
options,
gather information on, and then take forward in a proper paper for you later in the year.
I think it's something where we need to collect more data. The team needs to collect, needs to come up with options for this board to look at. It's one of the things that we have to talk about, and I think it's that because it's not that simple, and I think there's quite a discussion to be had, but we will have it at the appropriate time. Jonathan?
So could you just talk through what would happen if somebody phoned up the HFEA saying, I think maybe I was donor conceived. My parents have said no, but I'm just having an odd feeling. Is there anything we can do if we don't have that's all we've got?
Well, obviously we can take they would do an application.
Right.
So they would do an application, they obviously know their parents' names and dates of birth, and as long as they've reached the age of 16, they can apply for a certain amount of information. If they're 18, they would be able to have the identifiable donor. Obviously there's checks within that, there's identity checks along with in the application process, there's checks with the clinic, but yes, they would be able to have
even though they didn't know the clinic?
Because each cycle we would know the parents' names and dates of birth, the child's name and dates of birth. We can then check that back with the register. We'll have the clinic number where that treatment took place.
Okay, thank you.
Alex?
I just thought, sorry, back to the cyber point, the other risk is with this publicity is that, someone sets up opening the registers.com, pay me 50 quid and I'll tell you who your donors are type thing. So whether we want to, it's us losing the information, but also fraudsters doing that, which obviously is totally outside our control, but we might just want to think about, is there any way we can kind of monitor those and get them shut down?
I mean, that's a fair point for us to think about, and again, I'm going to look to you if to think about this and maybe give some support to the team about the sorts of things, because there's not a lot we can do, but there probably are things we can do that we might not know that with your help would be really
even
good,
just
Alex.
a policy about what when we someone alerts us to that they've been scanned.
Exactly. So that would be really helpful. I think that would be great. And Catherine, has sort of the task, and it's been fine of just generally overseeing that from a board point of view that OTR is sort of on track and so on. With Alex. Is there anything you want to add, any particular other than what the team have said? Yeah. Great.
No.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I mean, this is an enormous amount of work, and I think it's worth saying at this meeting that the team is very, very stretched. We know from the communications over legislative reform, when we launched the consultation and we gave all those interviews to both on TV and radio and in the newspapers and social media and so on, the thing that everybody picked up on was donor conception and OTR and so on, which surprised us actually, because that's the thing that everybody was most interested in. So it is clear that there's going to be some sort of media storm on this once this really gets going. And we have a very, very stretched team who are doing a great job. But we have to be mindful of that. Because, moving more people into the team means we can't do something else. It's always the age-old problem. But I think we have to be very, very mindful of that. But in the meantime, they're doing a great job. So we'll, have the next update in July, and we're getting very closer to the D-Day, really. Okay. So that leads us nicely onto an important topic that is really for decision today, which is on donor contact.
So is it worth us taking a break? We've got 2 long papers.
We've got
very much.
All right. Well, look, would people like that 5-minute break? I'm aware that some people have to rush for their trains, so I don't think we should take too long. But why don't we have a sort of 5 or 6 minute comfort break? You can get a cup of tea, bring it back in, go to the loo, whatever, and we'll be back about
No chat.
Not
allowed to chat. No chatting. Not allowed to chat.
Okay, sorry.
That's all right.
Well, no,
We've made
there.
Well, that's why.
We're there at the same place.
No, you're right. We are.
If people take 10 minutes.
Yeah. I was going to register so that when these donor-conceived young adults turn 18, they are entitled to come to us and seek identifying information about their donors. So not only are we obliged by law to hold this information, we are now obliged by law to give them this information. And that has required an enormous amount of work. We don't yet know numbers of how many young adults that might be, but we do know that 1 in every 170 births, I think it is roughly, is through donor conception and growing, and there are already existing a large number of, maybe Rachel and Claire will have some idea a bit later, but it could be a very considerable number over time. Although we aren't very clear now what those numbers are. But as you know, we've been looking at this for many months now. A number of operational decisions will flow from it. How we contact donors, for example, to notify them that a donor-conceived individual has requested identifying information is one of the things that we need to consider. It's not straightforward at all. There are many different rights and obligations at stake here. There are also some sort of anomalies in the 2005 law, I would say, from the point of view, anomalies in terms of time moving on, because, talks about last known postal address, does not talk about email, for example. So the law requires us to provide last known postal address, which, given the fact that people rarely use the post and the state of the post of the Royal Mail at the minute, notwithstanding, that's a really odd way to contact people these days. So there are a lot of things that flow from the change in the law in 2005 that we are now having to deal with. So as a background to that, that's the background, and I'm now going to ask two Rachels, because we've got Rachel Cooper sitting over there, who is working on this as well, to outline the issues that are for discussion and decision for us.
Thank you, Julie. Yes, just to introduce Rachel Cooper. Rachel is our legal advisor in the policy team and has put a substantial amount of work, so thank you very much into getting this paper ready. So, as Julie has said, we have an absolute statutory duty in law to provide donor-conceived individuals with the information about their donor, and that will be identifiable information from the end of this year. How we do that is very complex, and this is about the processes that we do it. We have to do it, but what we do around it to deliver a good service is what we're thinking about today. So just as background, the HFEA has a power, but not an absolute obligation, to contact donors to let them know that identified information is going to be released. They obviously don't have a choice that information is going to be released, because in law, the name, the date of birth, the place of birth, and the last name postal address will be absolutely given out to the donor-conceived individual. But it's always been an expectation from the sector, and it's always been in our communications, that the donor will be notified when this information is going to be released, whether that's been through clinic focus, patient information in clinics, through information on our website. There's always been that message that was decided back in 2004 2004, 2005, that donors would be given some information to say your information is going to be released, and maybe and in that letter offer support and any support that they want to do. So the plan is to contact the donors using the last contact details on the register, or that might be something that has been updated through the clinic. However, we wanted to question whether that was the right thing to do, and also we had some communication from the sector who raised concerns that if we were giving an address out that was 18 years old, the donor conceived individual, that's not particularly going to be the right thing for the donor conceived individual. So we started to investigate whether we could try and find out use a third-party database to find addresses for donors and then work out what we could possibly do with that. But while we've been investigating it and discussing it, there are lots of risks associated with this, both reputational and legal, and will have impact on the donors specifically themselves. So I'm just going to hand over to Rachel so she can explain the legal side of it.
So the paper goes through in quite some detail all the legal provisions underlying these issues. What I want to emphasise is that there are two separate issues at play, and one are the provisions that relate to disclosing information to the donor-conceived individual, and those are quite restrictive, and as we've got on the bottom half of the slide there, the information that the authority can be required to disclose is limited to information that's on the register, that's being provided by the donor after 31st of March, and is the last known postal address.
Sorry, Rachel, could you just speak up a tiny bit? I'm so sorry.
So the bottom half of the slide indicates what the authority is required to disclose to a donor-conceived individual. When it comes to contacting a donor, there's a different provision, and as Rachel's already pointed out, it's a power, not an obligation, to notify a donor that an application has been made for their identifying details. So those are the specific provisions, and that's all against the backdrop of very extensive disclosure prohibitions in the HFE Acts, and also more recent data protection laws which essentially protect the data subject, so in this case the donor.
Thank you. So looking at the key risks, this is all laid out in the paper, but I think you can see that no option is without risk, whether that's legal, reputation or ethical risks, and often they actually conflict with each other. So the legal risks could be a breach of confidentiality. We know that the laws around confidentiality and breach of donors has serious implications. If that was accidentally disclosed, that would be of a serious nature. But also there might be a breach of data protection law if the donor-conceived individual is provided with information that the donor has specifically chosen not to give to the HFEA. So I know we've had some clinics that are actually proactively contacting their donors to ask them to update the data, and some have been quite shocked and said, well, I don't want my address given out, I just want an email address given out, so I'm not giving you an address. But of course we have to, by law, give out the last known post address. So we have to think about the informed consent that the donor undertook when they donated and what information that they were given. There are operational risks for us. For example, we don't have any current access to NHS systems at the moment, and if we did explore and go down the route of any of the options which required extra processing steps, that has significant resource implications on the team, not just in terms of time it takes, but we would actually require more staff. There's, of course, the reputational risks that the HFEA want to do their best, the donors and the donor-conceived individuals, to make sure that this information is given out sensitively, and we do a good job with this. And of course, if we're knowingly giving out an address that is wrong, that could be immensely disappointing for the donor-conceived individual. And we might be seen out of date by using postal addresses and being publicly criticised for knowingly disclosing incorrect addresses. So the paper outlines the options, and what we want you to do is consider the legal, reputational, ethical issues and risks as part of each of those options, and to take note that there are two different populations. What we do for the donor and the donor conceived individual is distinctly different. And of course, if we did use the third party database, that could only be for UK donors, and we know a significant amount of donors, especially on the donor sperm, has been imported from overseas, and we wouldn't have access obviously to other countries' databases. So appreciate any comments or questions, and I'd open it up for discussion, please.
Zaina, to start.
Thank you. This is really helpfully laid out. Looking at the annex table, when you're considering the reputational risk and rating it, have you as a team considered it a greater reputational risk, like you've just said, for people to say the HFEA have knowingly given an address that they knew wasn't right, or do you think it's a bigger or similar reputational risk to say the HFEA have gone and done something that's not what they said they were going to do, which is, look up addresses that were not the addresses that were last provided to by the donors themselves? Because it seems either of those things could have a reputational risk. And I was surprised that option E was rated as a medium reputational risk, because I would intuit that the reputational risk there could also be very high, because if an organisation is seen to sort of improvise and do something that's not what they've been saying they're going to do, that could have kind of implications for public trust and other things we say we're going to do, etc.
Yes, I agree, because in 2005, when donors were told they were donated, they were told that we would contact them, but that would be facilitated through providing their updated details to the clinic or to the HFEA. It would not have been, it wasn't out there in information that third-party databases would be used. So yes, that could be a reputational risk.
When I'm looking at this, I'm thinking the obvious choice is option A, because these days there is so much information out there that I think even providing out-of-date address, provided the name is there and the other information you're required to give by law, anyone could more or less find whoever they're looking for. And I think as long as it's made clear that the address may be out of date, I don't see what reputational risk that would be. You can only provide the information that you have and that you're allowed to provide. And if donors have had an option to actually update their addresses, if you've said you've had a media call for people to update addresses, to choose not to do so, then I think they've chosen not to do so. And I think it would be wrong to then go and find a more up-to-date address through the NHS website or whatever.
Thank you, Jonathan.
And what would be really helpful to know, which we don't know, is how many people fall into the different groups. So how many donors are there who are actually not wanting their current information driven? Do we have any indication as to how many people are falling into that category? No. I didn't know whether feedback from clinics who had written to people were getting letters back saying, I do not want to be notified.
All we know at the moment is that when we've done publicity campaigns and when we've had donors who are anonymous contact us to re-register, they actually actively are offering that information to become identifiable. And that's, I think it's under 1.5% of all donors that we've got pre-2005. But of course they weren't counselled that they were going to be identifiable. But we don't know how many donors will have forgotten about 18 years ago or can't wait for 18 years to come so that they can find out if they've got donor conceived children.
So one of the reputational issues I think that Christine alluded to is kind of it's sort of a balance of rights, the rights of the donor conceived individual to kind of relevant information, but also we've set up, the legal word is not precedent, donors have been told that they will be informed that their information is being released. So if they have not updated their details, then it may go, for example, to a university halls of residence, and then the next thing they know, they get contact from a donor conceived individual. So one of the sub-messages of this kind of call to action in the media is really to remind kind of donors from the last 18 years, they might not want to update their address, but they might want to think about the fact that they might very well be kind of get an email soon or contacted on social media.
And the risk of the donors was given the information at the time of donating that we would contact them when their information was going to be released. That would be facilitated by them providing that updated information. So if we wrote to an old address that could be a parent's or a Hawthorne residence, and disclosure was unfortunately happened at that time, then that was the donor was under the obligation to update, so it didn't happen. That risk is a little bit lower than perhaps using an updated address through a third-party supplier and then it being disclosed.
Can you deliver? You used to be able to send mail where you had to guarantee it was given to the person. If that person is no longer at that address, can that be?
So we can.
Cost more money.
It does cost more money, but
twice as dear.
Might be cheaper than.
You can do that, and then you get a card back. We can track and trace the letter to say whether it's been collected, whether it's not at that address, and we have talked about that.
Okay, hang on, in order of hand. So Alison, then Gudrun, Graham, Tim.
Yeah, just looking at the risk of sending letters to, I think Claire, you said it very well there, halls of residence or whatever, some sort of risk matrix that you know that's an incorrect address, so therefore sending that is not appropriate because somebody might open it. I think the special delivery process is one that we used for patients about storage when we're trying to contact patients with gametes in storage, and that I think is certainly worth considering rather than sending a letter to an address. And even though it's illegal to open someone else's mail, we know people do, and breach of confidentiality in fertility centres with letters going to the wrong address happens not frequently, but because the fertility databases with patients' details are not linked to their NHS records, patients very often think that we have their most up-to-date record, their most up-to-date address, because they've told their GP or they were at the eye clinic last week. But that doesn't filter through to the fertility centres databases because they're standalone because of the confidentiality within the Act. So using a third party is almost looking at like a fourth party. By the time you check the HFEA register, the centre, then another database, you're comparing 3 different locations for address, which is very complicated and highly high risk for sure. So I think all these things taken into consideration, which I'm sure you've talked through, Rachel, you probably did the same for chasing people's gametes in storage, the special delivery method. It's cumbersome. You have to take it to the post office, you've got to pay your money. Quite a lot of money. But at the end of the day, the risk has to be fully explored.
Gudrun, next.
So I'm just a little bit confused. When these donors gave their sperm, we're talking about sperm donors here, and egg donors.
It's all donors.
Presumably, they wanted to donate so they could give a chance of a life to a family who couldn't have a baby, right? So presumably they wanted to, and they knew they had to be, in 18 years, they potentially could be contacted. So I suppose what I'm saying is that do we have any handle on how many of those individuals now don't want to be contacted?
No.
Because
none at all. Absolutely.
But it's also neither here nor there. So has anybody asked a community of donors, would, just randomly, not specifically, would they still want to be contacted after 18 years?
Well, there's actually
the only way to do that is to contact them.
No, but there's been work in Manchester by Petra Nordqvist and her team, specifically interviewing donors, old donors, and by and large, what they find is that donors who donated post-2005 are very open to being contacted and very sensitive about not stepping on the toes of the family. So I think particularly for that cohort of donors who donated quite soon after the change of law, because there was so much publicity and discussion about it and the numbers did dip, those donors in particular were very conscientious and mindful when they were donating. The social science research we have available on donors certainly suggests that they will be very open to being contacted, but that doesn't mean they've necessarily had it in their minds to update their addresses.
No. But also that's donors.
So that's positive, I think. That's positive, no? So my next question is, do the donors know whether they've conceived a child?
The donors can contact the HFEA to find out the year of birth, the sex, and the number of children that have been born. We do have some donors that do that, but
do we know how many of those donors have done that? Because those donors probably presumably are interested in the children they've conceived, and they're potentially more likely to want to be. You see what I'm saying?
I think we're making a lot of assumptions.
I think I don't think. Yeah. Hang on a second, Tim.
I think following from the comments about the storage, I mean, we spend an enormous amount of time as a clinic tracing people who have eggs, embryos and sperm stored with us in a non-donor setting. And it amazes me that they don't update us.
Yes.
These are their own gametes and embryos. So I think the proportion of donors from 10, 15, 18 years ago who would have updated will be really low. Because most people will have moved on. A few people will be doing it, but most people won't have done. So reading all this on the train on the way down, I was sort of thinking, well, option B and C, but I'm increasingly thinking A, and I think it probably would have to be a recorded delivery type thing or something, and then beyond that, we've done what we can do. We can't do anymore. As soon as you start getting other databases in, you start asking for donors to get back in contact with you, it doesn't happen because we're chasing people all the time. The amount of work for the HFEA will be huge with this, never perfect.
Grand.
I mean, I agree with Tim about option A. That my problem with it when I was looking at the options was it feels rather unimaginative, and that's what we will be accused of. I mean, it will be the risk of, we're not making enough effort. That would be the problem with it. So I do think there is quite a reputational risk attached to it. I do get about 6 times a year, I get a special delivery from a particular source, and since COVID, that's changed completely. They're now put through the door like everything else. That might be because they know me, but it's certainly, don't believe that special delivery relates to you showing ID or anything like that. Recorded delivery just records the fact that it's been delivered. Special delivery means it's been received by a person, that's all. But I've noticed the last few times I've had special delivery, it's been along with the rest of the post, just stuck through the door. The Postal Service has gone to pot, that's the truth of it, and here we are relying on a service that's less reliable and less secure than email is nowadays. I mean, that's the problem with the law in relation to all of this. And I think we need to, I don't know how we can be upfront about that, but we are stuck with a system that doesn't serve donors or donor-conceived individuals well. And my feeling is that as an authority, we need to be clear about this and how we are hemmed in by the law as it stands. And it's one of those things, I think, in Modernising Fertility Regulation, we need to change, and it needs alteration, and urgently.
Well, one of the planks of modernisation, and we'll come to it in our next thing that we've asked for, is for records to follow the patient. So this ridiculous thing currently where fertility sector records don't follow into NHS generally is one of the issues that one of we've got this issue. So you're right. Catherine, Alex, Gita.
I spent a long time thinking about this. I don't think there's a very obvious answer, but I did find it useful to go back to what must have been behind the change in legislation. And it seems to me that what must have been the guiding principle is to create a better mirror between the rights of the donor-conceived individual and the obligations of a donor. And it seems to me that in the detail of what we are empowered to hand over by way of identifiable information, we've got to remember that it's precisely that. We are handing over identifiable information. We are not setting up expectations or indeed requirements about how that's used. And if we look at what we do supply, then the identifiable pieces are well above the last known address. They are in and of themselves enough for donors to be contacted by donor-conceived individuals. The fact that by dint of the time, we've got this anomalous last known address, simply needs to be flagged, in my view, simply needs to be flagged properly to both donors and donor-conceived individuals, and with a clear caveat that it may well not be the current address, and with clear caveats about trying to mitigate as much as we can the risk of individuals being incorrectly informed. So much as from an assistance point of view, from an empathetic point of view, I was quite drawn to options B and C. The more I thought about what the legislation is asking us to do and the limits on what we must do with our limited resources, it seems to me that actually all the arguments go in favour of retaining option A and being loud and clear about why we're retaining it, and making it quite clear that we acknowledge all of those reservations that have been expressed to us about the potential downsides, but that properly mitigated in the way that the paper outlines, and some. Actually, that's the extent of our responsibility as the regulator.
Alex?
I came down on option B, also giving it a thought, and I'm always struck. I know we're not quite in kind of Caldecott governance territory, but I'm always struck by Dame Fiona's kind of edict that the duty to share information is as important as the duty to keep information confidential. And so I actually felt that, and taking into account it was the lowest reputational risk, that for these individuals we should do all we can to try and contact them accurately. And you can agree with everything Graham said, but having been stuck where we are with postal addresses, I feel we should try and knowing there's that database available for England and Wales, we should try and use it.
Gita? Yeah, I have to say I am thinking about option B. And I know it's going to cost more, but probably that might be the better option for us. And about the delivery, special delivery bit, I would support that. I would support my colleagues, because that did work during the storage extension period, contacting people with special delivery. And just the final thought I have is, how we left this too late. Could we have done this a few years ago and prepared better and got clinics to contact our donors to try and get their latest address? I mean, that's just something I've been thinking about.
It's ex post facto, isn't it? So, Francis?
I should declare I was Caldecott Guardian for 12 years. And actually I find this a really, really difficult question. At the HFEA, we don't have the phrases a legitimate relationship with the sperm donors or egg donors. We are not their treating clinicians, and so I don't think there is any circumstance under which we would be given direct access to the NHS database. The only people who could legitimately do that would be the treating centres. In which case, is there a path where we might consider that actually it's the treating centre that would contact the gamete donor to say that information is going to be disclosed to the donor-conceived individual? Because it would not be inappropriate for them to know where somebody lives, whereas it might be for us, and we would only then be informed of a change of address if the donor gave permission to the clinic to give that information to us at the HFEA. That way, I think, probably ticks all the boxes in terms of information governance. To return to my earlier...
Hang on a second. Rachel just wants
to come back on that point, we have to think about the confidentiality in the Act regarding the disclosure of donors. So if a clinic might be nervous about updating, find an address through a third-party database, private clinics can't get access to that system anyway. And if they then wrote to someone and it got disclosed, it would be the clinic's breaching the law. So when we change the storage regulation, so donors in the new legislation, donors can store for 55 years. Donors before that could only store for 10 years for use for everybody, or after 10 years for those with premature infertility. We sent quite a clear message out that clinics should be very cautious about contacting donors to ask them if they want to update their address because of the risk of breach of confidentiality.
Right, okay. My other question from earlier was in terms of the security of the information that we're handing out. Letting potentially the wrong person know that somebody was a gamete donor is obviously a significant breach of confidentiality, but probably has less severe consequences than disclosing the identifying details about the paternity of a donor-conceived individual. So that piece of information is the one that is the most sensitive. Are we constrained by law to send that information by post as well, or could we give the donor-conceived individual a choice as to how they receive that information? Because on the whole, post is less secure than email.
We do, yeah. No, the donor-conceived individual can get that information by email.
So they can
absolutely. It's through that's done through the secure application process. So that's it's not, we're not concerned about that. It's the actual how we contact the donor to say that their information is being released.
Jason first, and Zainab, and Jonathan.
I was relatively on the fence at the beginning of this conversation, and I'm not anymore because obviously it's a minefield, and I think in situations like this, probably the best approach is to keep things simple.
Yeah.
And option A is the simplest approach in my mind, and carries the least risk, and also the least risk of additional burdens to clinics as well as the HFEA, I would suggest.
Thank you. Zainab?
I'm sort of thinking a little bit about what Christine and Catherine have said earlier, which is that I think the whole parcel of information that's being provided to the donor-conceived individual is going to give quite a lot of information that's going to enable them to find out contact details for the donor or more details about the donor, where they're not necessarily having to rely on the address that we've provided in order to contact the donor. So it could almost be that last known address, especially if we provide the caveat that in many instances this was provided 18 years ago, is going to become more or less obsolete. So in terms of what we do, it's less important for really the donor-conceived individual than for the donor when we think about what address we use. And for the donor, I understand that we want to give them advance warning if possible. And we also don't want to kind of go above our legal remits and whatever in terms of finding out new addresses. But I think the idea, the risk that if we just use an 18-year-old address to send information to a donor, it might go to a halls of residence and be opened by a random person or whatever. That's a risk, but I think it's also a risk if the donor has not updated their address and they haven't really thought much about donation, that they get a letter from the HFEA at a more recent address from this other PDS list that it's going to fall into the hands of their partner or somebody else with whom they have not had the chance to have that conversation. So the risk of that information being accessed by somebody other than who is intended is high in both scenarios, and arguably is going to have a more extreme consequence for the donor in the scenario where we're going through the kind of the more laborious activity of trying to find a more updated address, whether or not we use special delivery or not. So that it seems quite hard to justify, even from a minimizing risk or harm to donors' perspective, to kind of go above and beyond and use that kind of address. And I think, I was thinking coming in anyway, but I think with the sort of caveat that Catherine mentioned, where if we just really make it clear that this address was provided in whatever, 2005 or whatever, and therefore is not likely to be current, then then that's giving quite a clear message to the donor that maybe the first thing they do should not be going round to that house or writing a letter to that property. And I wonder, in terms of the HFEA's intention to let donors know, I don't know exactly how that needs to be interpreted, but could that be, just in terms of resource management, if we were to pour more resources like you guys have been doing around the, donor conception day or whatever, where we're not necessarily letting individual donors know, but we've got large campaigns to let donors in general know that the register is being opened, are we fulfilling part of that intention?
I mean, look to Rachel, legally, I assume not, but kind of by default, if there is more kind of awareness that this is happening, then we would hope there'd be a trickle-down effect for people.
And again, legally we have no obligation to notify a donor, but we've said we're going to, and I think the implication is we're going to do more than just let donors generally know the time has come where they might start getting this information. It's more specific than that, and we told them to keep their address up to date because we're going to write to that.
So one way we could try and deal with the problem of the wrong person opening the letter is if the letter doesn't actually say the information, but simply says, please contact the HFEA because we've got some important information for you. And I mentioned this to the Rachels before, and that's going to be a costly issue, but at least that should slightly mitigate the danger that a partner or parent or the wrong person will open the letter.
But wouldn't they just guess that?
Yeah, but why else would the HFEA be asked?
But also, I think we've looked through
one meeting.
I think we've looked through Rachel has looked through various options. And one of the real risks with that is people don't know, we all get letters saying, you must contact us urgently. And
you just straight away.
So I think there is a risk that unless it kind of someone twigs, that doesn't kind of, each of these options has risks.
Alison? Just to come back to Geeta's point about the centres, unfortunately I was around when this was being discussed in the early 2000s, and we were looking at New Zealand as the model where the removal of anonymity had worked very well for the donor and the donor conceived. And centres were aware at that time that this was the reason that we were introducing that the donor should be encouraged to maintain contact and update address. So I think clinics should have been, whether they did or not, but clinics should have been proactive from that date onwards. I think what's happened is we haven't been proactive, and now it's this situation that we're ended up in. So I think pointing to the HFE to say that perhaps you should have done more, I think we should have done more, and that was the premise when we took this in 2004. It was very much based on this was going to be happening, and there were lots of discussions at lots of national meetings about how this was going to be happening, and everybody thought 16 years down the line I won't be in post or whatever, and perhaps didn't instill that in the centre's practice and policy.
I know, I meant collaboratively. Yes. We should have done this together with clinics.
Jason.
I was going to say that we can't guarantee that there'll be 18-year-old addresses, can we? Because some centres may have your addresses on record, and donors may have maintained contact. And also, I think this has been said before, but it really is incredibly easy to find people if you're determined enough, even if you don't have their latest address. So I don't think option A is really harmful in that respect.
So I'm kind of pretty comfortable with the kind of Catherine clause for the donor conceived individual that actually the address is quite spurious for reasons everyone has said, and as Jason just said, you can find individuals. I'm still a little bit uncomfortable for the question about contacting the donor, that we haven't done everything that's possible to find their new address, knowing that at least in England and Wales there's a possible option. So I think where the question is about donors, we should we should try and do more, because otherwise I think we're just saying, well, look, we tried to, we used the address on the record. So for donors, I'm still coming down on
I think the other thing with the donors, though, I think in paper it alludes to looking for that NHS number. That wasn't used in many centres. There were local numbers used, and NHS numbers were very rarely used. Neither were passports at the time. So trying to identify, if you're trying to identify somebody, to go through each step to make sure you've got the right person, you're starting off with very, very basic information. And a lot of donors have come from sperm banks. So this, although centres will be contacting donors, the major sperm banks in the UK, this is a big piece of work for them if we then say that they need to find out up-to-date addresses for donors, and the sperm banks are not in an NHS setting. So I think we've got to be careful of what we're trying to do here. As Jason said, those that want to have updated their address, we will know those that have not updated their address since the day they registered, and that's about as far as we can go for sure. To take it any further is a huge amount of work to make sure, if you're going to take it to that nth detail, then it's a lot of work. It's not just a case of cross-checking a database, because you could have the same person with the same name and the same date of birth on an NHS database, and the NHS number might not be there. I know certainly for us, we used a local unit number, and I think a lot of centres used a local unit number to identify patients and donors.
I'm going to ask Rachel to come back in, but I think it's very important to bear in mind our legal duty under the Acts, under the legislation, which is to provide a certain amount of information to the donor-conceived individuals, and our feeling as an effective regulator that this is the right thing to do, to contact the donor if we can, but there's no legal duty to do so. So what we mustn't do is put ourselves in a position where we're using a huge amount of expense and resource to do a task which is a sort of nice to do, and risk prejudicing other tasks which are our statutory duty, which both are providing identifying information to donor-conceived individuals, but also carrying out all the other statutory tasks that we have that will be compromised if we have to put too much resource on getting in touch with donors. So, I think we need to be really clear here what our statutory duty is and the implications of going outside of that for everything else we're doing. Rachel.
It was just to follow on from Alison's, that when a donor is registered, you need the piece of identifiable information, which is NHS number or passport number. But certainly in the early days, it was a lot of passport numbers were provided. So when you do go on the NHS summary care record or whatever way you can do, we wouldn't have an NHS number to put in.
Okay. So, sorry, we just. It's like the white smoke, Any final comments? So this has been a really helpful discussion. We now have to come to a decision process. As I said, and I think it is really important that we do understand, I think we do, that we have a legal duty to provide information to donor-conceived individuals. We would like, and we think it is the right thing to do, to provide, to warn the donors that, when they were, a student 18 years ago, somebody might be knocking on the door any moment, but that is not a legal duty. And given all the other things that we're doing and the fact that we know at at the moment, with everything that's going on, we've got legislative reform, we've got the ALB review quite properly, we've got all this, which is stretching everybody to, breaking point over next year. We need to be careful that we're not compromising anything else we do, or indeed the effective working of OTR itself. So I just want to sort of put that to you before we take a decision. So I think the best thing to do was let's just have initially a quick show of hands, shall we? We don't really often do this, but I think we have sufficient difference in the room to make sure to have some sort of vote, and then we can decide what to do. So who thinks that, let's start from the bottom. Who thinks that E is the right? Nobody? Who thinks D? Who thinks C? Who thinks B?
With the explanation you've just given, I've now removed B as my option.
I've got Alex. And your point is well taken, Alex. I mean, it's not a stupid point by any means. It is well taken. And A? And that's everybody else. Okay. Well, look, I think, Alex, if you're happy,
of course.
I think, but I think we say we're going to go with AT, but I think Alex makes some very good points, and Geeta too, some very good points, and that when we're looking at A, we should just, always be mindful that there's something that we can tweak to make it a little bit better, a little bit more successful, particularly bearing in mind there's a woeful state of Royal Mail at the minute. But let's leave it to you, and doubtless anyway you'll be coming back to us with more finalised proposals and things. But thank you Rachel Cooper, and thank you team again. This is not only a lot of work, it's also a very complex piece of work, and everybody is very mindful of that we need to get it right. So we're grateful for your efforts in this. And thank you everybody else for a very good discussion. So everybody happy as far as we can go today? Yeah. Cool. Great. Thank you.
Cashless change.
Rachel.
Yes, we've got people in and out because we can't fit everybody in the room. Right. Now, Modernising Fertility Law. So we launched our consultation on 14th of April. 27th, was it? February. I mean, sorry. Closed on the 14th of April. Sorry, it's all a big blur at the minute. On the draft proposals. And interestingly, as I said before, there was really a very significant amount of media interest just on the consultation. Actually, it surprised me because I thought that the media interest would be once we'd analysed the results and so on. But the very fact of the consultation was generated, a very significant amount of media interest, which is great. The consultation, we now have the consultation, and we've done some preliminary analysis, which we're going to share with you. We need to be very mindful that this is only just, we haven't done it all. It's very much a first pass. I think it's important to remember, and I'm very mindful of this, that the end game is to deliver either side of the summer, potentially, or around that time, proposals to the Department of Health and Social Care with what we think legislative change should look like, right, and our views. The consultation has been a targeted consultation to inform those views, right, not to determine them. So there are a wide range of views coming out of these, out of the consultation, some of which we may consider to be that we should consider and we should, use to inform our proposals. Others which we will consider and decide that they are not appropriate to inform the proposals. So it's not determinant, it's just to help us. And it may be, and you will see, because we're going to make a decision on the way forward, that, there will be there are the answers to some questions which are sort of no-brainers. Everybody more or less agrees the same thing. It's all dead easy and we just go for it. And there will be other things which are quite complex, and there will be several possible, solutions. I think generally there's a consensus in a lot of areas that the law perhaps should change, but then there's no consensus about how. And we've got to then have further thinking about it. So it's, again, very large piece of work, very complex. But I think we just need to bear in mind this is, in order to get to the proposals to the department, that's for us, right? We can look at all the information, but it's our decision in the end. And then once we've handed over to the department, it's for them to see whether we can get parliamentary time and how that's going to, that's the next stage. But we need to be mindful of that. So today, very exciting, because I don't think we've all seen this before. We're going to ask Anna and Beth to help us to look at some of the preliminary findings. Again, you'll probably all have a million questions. Please ask them, but I'm just warning you that there may be quite a lot of times when the answer is don't yet know, because we haven't, the consultation, it's barely a month since it closed. And then there are 4 options about the way we present the information to the department that we'd like your decision on, and we'll come to that. So, firstly, ladies, over to you.
I'll say a few words.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Anna and Beth, confusingly, Paula is controlling the presentation online, so if you need her to move on to the next slide, if you just say something, perhaps if you move the microphone nearer you, that would be good. So just a few words by introduction. Paula, if you're able to move on to the first slide, which has got the overview. So I think, as Julia said, the idea of the consultation was to get kind of high-level input on the proposals that were developed over multiple years, as it says in the paper, with authority and also with the Legislative Reform Advisory Group, which had individuals from the key professional bodies, the British Fertility Society, ARCS, RCN, BECA and others. And they very much endorsed the direction of travel of the proposals. It was very high-level consultation. The idea was to get feedback on key ideas, and we're very appreciative that many people who responded to the consultation gave us very, very detailed feedback at a level that we probably didn't consult on, but obviously that will all be taken into account. As Julia said, we had very widespread media coverage, considering this was launch of a consultation, not actually launch of recommendations. Something like over 350 pieces of coverage in 17 national outlets. Very much the focus was on potential changes in donor anonymity, I guess, because that's very lay-friendly, and that attracts a lot of media coverage. So the presentation today, Anna will introduce the quantitative side, the kind of high-level responses, and Beth will interject as needed on the qualitative analysis. As you said, Julia, we're very much at the early stages of analysis, and the real aim for the discussion today is on the recommendations about what we do next and how we come back to you. Just to say that as we go through the slides, you'll see that they have a kind of watermark that says preliminary, because we haven't quality assured all the data. So if anyone was going to take a screenshot and use it, they will see that this is not checked and not the usual standards that we go through before publication. And lastly, whenever we do get to the publication of recommendations, we will be publishing a full report of the data, both quantitative and qualitative analysis.
Next slide, please, Paula. Brilliant. So as Claire said, we were really pleased with the responses to the consultation. We had a really positive response to most of our proposals on the whole, and a very high number of responses. And we were very pleased with the high number of submissions, but we want to emphasise that this consultation was never intended to be a representative sample. So the numbers that we see today are of people who are most interested in replying to the consultation, rather than necessarily being weighted to an appropriate sample size. So in the first question in the survey, we asked, in what capacity are you responding to this consultation? And so here we can see the 5 main categories of respondents, which is how we will break down the responses to the consultation answers throughout this presentation. The patient group is quite broad because it does include current and past patients, partners of patients, donors, donor-conceived individuals, and parents of donor-conceived individuals. There were total approximately 9,000 submissions, however just over 2,000 were not included in the overview, either because they were duplicates, of which we had a very low number, or because they were incomplete. Now, incomplete doesn't mean that they didn't respond to every single response. Incomplete was when they didn't answer a single question throughout the whole consultation. None of the agree to strongly disagree or the free text. We're not sure why this number is as it was. Perhaps people just opened the consultation out of interest to read what we were consulting on, or perhaps they read it and then replied to it on a different device at a later point. And as you can see, the largest number of responses, around 81%, was from members of the public, and the significant number of responses is likely to be from a coordinated campaign. And I will now go through these different categories, all of these. So, types of patients, as I mentioned, so that can include current or past patients and partners. That did make up the most of those responding as a patient. We do want to note, however, that of those who replied as current or past patients, 42% of them had used or were currently using donor gametes or embryos, and so these responses do show a much greater than average use of donor gametes than the average patient in the UK, so 42% versus our latest donation report from 2019, which found that only nearly 1 in 6 IVF births used donor gametes or embryos. And then a quarter of those responding were parents of donor-conceived individuals, 8% of donor-conceived individuals, and only 2% of donors. So overall, this patient demographic in this targeted consultation does show a very large skew towards those involved somehow in donor conception than the average patient, who say, in the UK. But as Claire mentioned, a large number of the articles that were written and significant media interest was about that section on donor access and information provision of the consultation, so that perhaps led to this larger number. And the category of other includes future patients, intended parents, and also surrogates. Next slide, please. With types of organisation, the demographics did show that the majority of people who were answering as a patient and professional, or a professional with those involved in professional clinical organisations, whereas the distribution within those applying on behalf of the whole organisation was much broader. A third of organisations describe themselves as a patient representative group, and this does actually include a much wider range of patient representative groups than those perhaps traditionally represented at the HFEA. So it included, for example, the Donor Conceived Register and the Donor Sibling Registry, but it also included the responses from the Christian Institute and Right to Life UK. Next slide, please. And our final demographics overview is the average age of all respondents was 61, but this number was heavily skewed by the large number of those replying as behalf of a member of the public, where the average age was 65. So you can see that this is a median age of 27 years higher than those who were replying as patients. Sex was also skewed by members of the public, where 48% of the overall respondents were female, but 73% of those responding as patients were women. Unfortunately, over 84% of patients and professionals did not declare what sex they are, and so we do not have that information. As regards regions of where the respondents live, the majority did live in England, and a high percentage of the respondents of member of the public group lived in Northern Ireland, so 8% of respondents in the member of the public group lived in Northern Ireland versus 3% of the total population of the UK that lives in Northern Ireland. And we also had a very low number of respondents from outside of the UK, however, we were not looking for global use necessarily on our proposals at this time. Next slide, please. So now we're going to present some of the initial quantitative and qualitative data from the consultation. As Claire has noted, these are all provisional numbers, and we will have final numbers when we submit the report. There was broad agreement to our proposals throughout the patient safety and promoting good practice section of the consultation, and the qualitative analysis, which will be available in due course, will allow for a much more thorough explanation as to why specifically people are agreeing or disagreeing. This very much shows only headline views. Wait a moment just so you can absorb some of the numbers. But we can see here over 50% of patients and professionals in both these questions do either agree or strongly agree with the proposals that we set out in the consultation.
Anna, could you just tell us what the colours mean? Because that's quite hard to see.
To the left, the first bar chart, the sort of real HFEA teal is agree and strongly agree. Then in the middle, in yellow, is unsure. In the deep blue is disagree and strongly disagree. And the pink is null or prefer not to answer. So on each of the questions, it was possible to either click prefer not to answer, or you could skip entire sections. So many people decided to, for example, skip straight to scientific developments, hence why there are quite a significant number of null and prefer not to answer in every single of these.
This is a population of an N of 7,000, nearly 7,000, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So as we can see here, for example, there are very low response numbers from member of the public for patient safety promoting good practice questions. Next slide, please, Paula. And here, questions 3 and 4, which were on having a broad and more effective range of powers to tackle non-compliance and the powers to impose financial penalties across the sector, also broadly showed agreement and strong agreement. For example, in question 4, we have over 60% of patients agreeing that the HFEA should have broad ranges of powers to impose financial penalties. And Beth will now be able to comment a bit more on what some of the comments were in that section.
Yeah, so as we've noted several times so far, the qualitative analysis and quantitative analysis is ongoing. So this is just an early look into what sort of things that we're seeing. So regarding financial penalties, the question we asked, in the written responses, we saw that it's highlighted there is support for the use of financial penalties within the wider compliance network or framework. But there were some concerns raised about whether financial penalties may disproportionately affect NHS clinics or smaller clinics, and also whether these financial penalties may filter down to patients as well. And there were a small number of comments that alluded to the fact that financial penalties may not necessarily work well in the fertility sector specifically. Move to the next slide, please. Yes, it has. Sorry. So I'll be able to give a bit more context around these questions as well. Again, we can see that there is broad agreement to the questions that we asked. Regarding the question about explicit duty of the HFEA in clinics to promote patient care and practice, in the written responses referring to this question, it was often noted that the term patient might not necessarily capture all the relevant parties that are involved in fertility treatment. Particular emphasis was given to the need for care and protection of the resultant child, the donor-conceived individual, and the embryo as well. Treatment add-ons and costs were also often cited as two topics around patient care and protection and what the future regulation of these two things would look like. And finally, long-term support was noted as something that should be included in the duty of care towards patients. And moving on to question 6, where we asked respondents, thanks Paula, about whether the HFEA should have a broader range of powers regarding fertility-related products outside of licensed clinics. So written responses alluded to the fact that extending the scope of the HFEA Act to fertility services outside of the clinic may be beneficial. But more details are needed on the types of services that may fall within this before support for proposals can be given. And responses also noted that broader consumer protection might better address or play a role in regulating fertility services outside of clinics as well. Next slide, please.
And then the final two questions in the patient safety and promoting good practice consultation on the current appeals process and the setting of standard licence conditions, as with all the other questions in the section, did show a agreement and strong agreement across the board of all the respondents. Next slide, please, Paula. The second section, and the one which had the most interest and the highest number of respondents, was that on donor anonymity and information provision. And likewise, there's broad agreement to the questions, especially when we consider whether clinics should be required by law to inform donors and recipients of potential donor identification. We have well over 60% of patients agreeing with our proposals on this. As we can see, however, in the second question, which is about the dual track system proposed in our consultation, there are much wider levels of disagreement with much bigger bands of unsure, which we're going to comment on.
Yeah, so for this question, we saw that within the written responses, the people who responded to this question referred to other changes that they wanted to see, and this included support for full donor information before the age of 18. But it was noted that the implications of this need to be fully considered as well. And responses also highlighted the importance of providing up-to-date medical information for donors as well. And they also noted the importance of information about donor siblings and what the information access around this would look like as well. And written responses also alluded to some of the challenges of having a dual-track system. For example, it may be seen as unfair for the donor-conceived individuals who can't access information until 18 compared to those who could. And also the difficulty potentially of for clinics to administer this dual-track system as well.
Next slide, please, Paula. And then the final question, which was on accessing indications counselling before starting treatment. Here again, very positive response to our proposals. Next slide, please, Paula. The third section of the targeted consultation then asks questions about consent. I want to first focus on the second question on the sharing of fertility patient in a non-fertility medical setting, which had very positive reception across all groups. Nonetheless, the first question which we asked in this section is one that we'll be considering at the end of the presentation, because as this graph shows, there was a very wide range of agreement, disagreement and uncertainty across groups. Now, this does reflect the discussions that we had with Authority in September 2022 about the complexity of changing any consent regime and finding one that would work better, which again was reflected in the qualitative work that has been taking place so far.
Yeah, so we can see already in some of the written responses where there's kind of a mixture of responses here. So generally there's support for simplifying the consent process. Reasons for this is that currently it's quite lengthy, it's quite difficult, some of the language for patients to understand, and mistakes in the consent forms can lead to delays in treatment. However, generally the opt-out model wasn't necessarily supported due to concerns about not obtaining informed consent, not suitable necessarily for the complex considerations around fertility treatment, and it may not be considered patient-focused. There were several suggestions throughout the written responses, obviously, that we will continue to work through and look through for simplifying consent, and one example of those is that consent to parenthood, consent to treatment could be considered separately as a way to simplify the process.
And I just wanted to highlight before we move on, if we see here member of the public, it's over 90% choosing not to reply or prefer not to answer at this point. But if we go to the next slide, please, Paula, we can suddenly see there's a huge jump in responses from member of the public, and here is where we suddenly see much more, many more responses, both in the qualitative and quantitative work from members of the public. So we go from 95% preferring not to answer or missing the first two consent questions to over 90% submitting a response to this question on whether consent for donated embryo should be extended to give consent to research in embryo banking. Now, the initial qualitative analysis is here has shown that the disagree or strong disagree responses relate to a broader opposition to embryo research generally rather than necessarily to an embryo bank. Next slide, please, Paula. And then the final section of the targeted consultation on scientific developments. The overall message was still that there was a very clear positive reception to our proposals within patients and professionals and organisations. However, there is again strong disagreement from members of the public on both of these questions, again relating in part to broader opposition on embryo research. As the qualitative analysis is ongoing, we will be able to better establish the nuances within these responses regarding specific areas of scientific innovation and development that raise key questions and issues within those who responded, and where appropriate uses of secondary legislation or statutory instruments lies. And the initial qualitative analysis does show that people do support innovation, but also that they feel that strong regulation is required around any new developments. So the regulation of any new scientific developments will require the HFEA to work with other regulators, academic experts, professionals, medical bodies and the public more widely. Next slide, please, Paula.
Thanks, Anna. So that's the end of the quantitative and headlines of the qualitative analysis. So as we've said, we're looking at that in detail. We think there are 4 areas that require some further thoughts on our and your behalf. Not only because of the sort of varied responses to the consultation, but also the more kind of detailed conversations with individuals. So in no particular order. So elements of our regulatory powers, I think, despite best efforts, in hindsight, we didn't explain that as well as it could have been in the consultation. So we took this to mean, from a patient perspective, if something kind of looks like a clinic and feels like a clinic online, then a patient is assuming it's an HFEA clinic. And many will you've seen, and this, it's a good thing. There's more choice for patients. It's kind of an ease from wherever they are, accessing on their phone. But they are visibly look like a clinic, and the assumption is that there is some kind of HFEA oversight. And we often get patient complaints about various services that we can say, well, it didn't happen in a licensed centre, which is essentially a brick building, and therefore we can't do anything about it. So I think there's some work that we'll need to do with you and with others to explain a bit better about what that kind of wider regulation does mean. Particularly to explain it doesn't mean a kind of expansion of HFEA powers into, I guess, holistic therapies, other things that kind of are not coming into that sort of medicalised part of fertility treatment. Do you want to say anything else on that?
No, that's fine at this stage, because I think you're right, we can have the conversation later.
In terms of donor information provision, so I think we consulted after much discussion with yourselves and with the Legislative Reform Advisory Group. Because of the changing nature of information provision, which we kind of touched upon in the previous discussion, the system where we have kind of anonymity until 18 and then a right to access identifiable information is being challenged all the time by, we've used the example of DNA testing websites in the consultation. As well as there has been discussion about whether for some donors actually, that they are content to be contacted before a child turns 18, not to say that they necessarily, will play a big part in that child's life, but they are content to do that. So we did propose whether a kind of dual track system might be the way forward. And as Anna and Beth said, we had a kind of wide range of responses. And some of the responses go the other way, so that there should be all donors from the birth of a child should be identifiable, or none should. The register should be retrospectively opened up. It's a wide range of responses. And I think that the authority has probably not come to a kind of particular decision on what the way forward, whether it's only a dual track system, whether we just sort of say that the system that we have is the best of kind of the bad situation. So I think we need to do some more thinking with you on that. As we mentioned on consent, I think is where we had the most varied agree and disagree. And that's not to say, as Beth said, that people don't think the consent process should be simplified, but certainly the kind of an opt-out process, which was one of the things we thought might get some traction, there was definitely not a kind of unified support for that. So it's a question about the current system reflects what's in the law, how could the law be simplified so we can make this process more simple or easier. And I'm not sure we have a kind of direction of travel on that. And lastly, there were questions about secondary legislation. So I think both from those who are very would like some changes towards scientific developments and those who don't like it wanted more clarity about what would stay under primary legislation, what would stay under secondary legislation, and what the process would be to get to that decision, and also how, even if it was secondary legislation, you could still require kind of public engagement and involvement in those decisions. So I think those are the kind of 4 areas that are most murky at present. Should I pause there before we go on to kind of the decision, because we've given you a huge amount of information, so I'll pause there.
Gudrun.
I think it's astonishing. I find the pink line for the 5,582 members of the public. I was looking at the pink line thinking they're not answering any of these questions. And then suddenly they say, oh no, we don't want any more. what makes me wonder who that group were. You say they were an average age of 66.
I mean, we haven't got a slide here on risk, but I think we alluded to in the paper that one of the risks of going out to consult in this area is we know that there is a large swell of opinion of people who would like there not to be any embryo research whatsoever.
But that age group was an old people like me, right?
We can go back if you'd like, Paula, to the.
I just thought that was really. So where are all the 45-year-old members of the public who maybe were happy to have research? Do you see what I think? I thought it was. Look at that! Look how negative they are.
I think Gudrun, the way it answered, as far as I could see, was you've got interested parties like patients, professionals, organisations like the Royal College or whoever it is who are interested. And then where the members of the public who didn't identify as any of those came in, potentially it might be that some of them were aligned to special interest groups.
But it's astonishing,
were interested in a particular question.
I mean, what I'm thinking is that this is going to sound like conspiracy theory, but I'm sorry and apologise if it is. Someone out there was saying, get on them and stop them doing research on embryos. Does anyone feel the same way as me? Or am I going mad?
No, Peter's going to.
So I was looking at that and I was thinking, the little green band in there, the very beginning, which says, it's good, let's do more research, this is wonderful. Can we identify, can we pull them out and find out who those old people were? Or were they all the young people? Do you see what I'm saying? Is there any way you can do that?
But we can discuss that, I suppose, at a later date.
Because if you look at that little green band that goes all the way through, I'm thinking a lot of the pinks only suddenly decided to go blue at the end. I just wonder whether the green band would be an interesting group to look at the age of.
But by definition, they're all old, aren't they?
But it's an average, the age, isn't it?
I think, Gudrun.
Sorry, is this a
no, it's just to say this. I think there's an important distinction here. So let's be clear. What this is not is an opinion poll in which a reputable polling company goes out and tries to get a weighted sample of the population, right? And there's all sorts of other bits of evidence suggesting that when you do that, you get a much more varied or much more even sort of set of views about things like this. So in any consultation, particularly these days where it's relatively simple, but it was true when people used to write in with views, this isn't groups organise themselves in order to get their views across. That's an entirely proper and legitimate thing to do. And I suspect that's a big part of what's happening here. Now, the crucial thing is two. One, we don't discount those views merely because they're part of an organised campaign, wherever they come from. And that secondly, going back to Claire and Julia's earlier comments, the point of the consultation was to provide you with something that informs your thinking. It's not remotely determinate. We're not looking at this thinking, we're over the 51% mark on this, therefore the answer is. It is giving us some additional evidence within which you can think about the task ahead. And crucially, as you'll remember, the task ahead is effectively, this is a body that's been using this law for 30 odd years. If anybody knows where it works well and where it doesn't, we do. Which doesn't mean to say there aren't people out there who have all sorts of bright ideas and legitimacy as well. And that we, for the moment, are engaged with a piece of work for the department on the basis of what we think, on the basis of all these years of experience, the law could be modernised. This is helpful supporting information, but I don't think the best use of our time is in digging in to the fine print demographics of who the little green bit is in the corner who might be slightly different.
I agree.
The early stuff from Anna and Beth made it clear that, the in various places, isn't it, where, people interested in donation clearly applied to this, responded in a way that doesn't match their use. And clearly, the member of the public is a cohort of people who, as I say, have entirely legitimate views, but are distinct from, skewed towards, they don't represent the population as a whole. No. So it's obviously interesting. I think, and if we should take anything away from this, I think it is the continued controversy and contested nature of views around things like embryo research. It may have been going on for 30 odd years, but it's clearly not, entirely settled. So, there are some also interesting questions in here, but I think given the task ahead, I'm trying to unpick and second guess what the demographics are telling us isn't actually going to give us clarity on the kind of recommendations you want to make to the department in the coming months.
And also, I think just to add to that, as Peter said, there are a range of wholly legitimate views about embryo research and so on. They are probably not views that, certainly they're not the views that the law holds at the minute, and may well be not views that we want to hold. But they're out there. So we could just note them, and that and then we sort of, when we came to our decision, we note them. That's not to say necessarily we either need to take account of them or agree with them.
Should we go on to the
yes,
options?
I think that we should go on to the options.
So, Cora, if you can move on to the last. So, we outlined 4 options here. There are probably others, but just kind of to try and get to a conclusion. We had hoped to be able to come to you in July with a kind of set of recommendations in draft that you would say, we really like numbers 1 to 6, number 8 needs a bit more work, and if you could do that over the next 3 weeks and sort of done and dusted. We can carry on doing that as planned. We could do that, but then take out those 4 areas that I discussed before, so consent, donor anonymity, the kind of regulation of sort of allied fertility services, and what would be primary and secondary legislative decisions, kind of take those 4 areas out and go spend a bit more time looking at those in more detail, and only kind of progress with the recommendations that are more straightforward. We could do quite a lot more work on those recommendations over, say, the next year, including kind of lots of work with clinic staff and stakeholders, and come up with some very detailed proposals. I don't know, Peter, if you want to say a bit more about the kind of merits, if you like. I don't want to put you on the spot of kind of us saying to the department, here's an area where we think there needs to be change, like consent, but not actually saying what we think the change should be.
So let's think of where we are in the process. So what we've started is a conversation about, hopefully, that will lead to an updating of the law. Because of where we are in the cycle, there is no parliamentary time before the next election, whenever that is. So even if the department thought that everything we were suggesting was absolutely, exactly where ministers want to go, that can't happen before an election. There simply isn't parliamentary time. So to pick up Claire's point, is part of this is about identifying not just where the law doesn't work, but what we think are the proposals for fixing it. And equally legitimate, given where we are in the cycle, might be giving them a clear sense of where the law doesn't work and why it doesn't work, but also not yet being in a position to articulate in detail what the solution is. And I think that's quite legitimate. And so I think what we're saying is you don't need to get to a place where you have a fully worked out answer to every problem before we engage with the department. We can do a mix of things, and I think, as the discussion today suggested, there's quite a lot here where there's a pretty good consensus that something isn't working as well as it could, and probably a pretty good consensus of what, in broad terms, the shape of the answer is. Not to the last degrees, because if anybody's ever involved in legislation, there's an awful lot of work to do to tease out the fine print. But there's also a quite legitimate point in which you could decide on the 15 things here, 11 of them, we've got a pretty good sense of what the problem is and what the solution is. And on 4 of them, we've got a pretty sophisticated understanding of what the problem is, but we're not as close to where the solution is. And I think that's an entirely legitimate view for you to take. So I think what we're saying here, you can go reasonably early or take longer, and all of those are legitimate things, because at some point, this is what we're engaged in here is the next stage of a dialogue, principally with the department and possibly more widely in time, that will lead us to a place where there is, a clear consensus on what a modernised fertility law might look like. Does that help?
Can I also add, because and I think the slide as itself is really helpful, but I would have characterised one just a little bit differently, which is, for example, is exactly as Peter said, what we go to the department with in July, we have to discuss it now, but is these are as Peter said, the 11 or 10 or whatever it is, recommendations where we've got broad consensus about what the issue is and what the solution might be. And here are the 4 things that actually there's consensus about the problem, but we'd like to go away and talk more about the solutions. But we don't hold it up. We go to them sort of now, or when I say now, July this side of the summer, the other side of the summer, and say this is where we are, and then we'll do a bit more work and we can decide what that needs to be on the few outstanding things. So that at least there's, it sort of gets into the timetable, everyone starts thinking about it and so on. So that's sort of how I see one. It's up for discussion, but that's, Graham and then Catherine.
I agree with that, but I think my only concern about it as the way forward is that in some ways this whole package, one area affects another, and so you can't discreetly take out some of these areas without it having some sort of knock-on impact. So take consent, for example, it has so much to do with everything else. And one of the striking things about the consultation for me was that what the feedback in the consent area reflects our own difficulties around this. I think it was rather it suggested that actually this board is in touch with what the public and professionals think, because we're as divided as the public opinion was. But I find it difficult to leave that out, even though I support what you're saying. And one of my questions is, how are we going to move on in that debate? It's not just leaving it for a year that will sort that out.
Agreed.
I think we need some way of coming to some conclusion if we think there needs to be changes in the law in that area. And that's the bit that I'm not very clear about, how we will become clearer after we've had a good consultation like this and we are undecided ourselves.
So, Graham, I think, just to come back to you, I think that we're talking, there are 2 separate things. There is, what do we say to the department now? So it's July, for argument's sake, July, it'll be this time. And to be honest, this is after our conversations with the department, I think where they probably are minded to support is, the first thing is, go with everything, saying, look, these are where we think the answers are. These are the 3 or 4 areas which will need a bit more work. But of course, to get to a draft bill, you've got to have all the answers. Nobody's going to start drafting, really. No. It's just that they need to have an overall picture. The second question, which has not yet been addressed, but is probably for a bit later on, July or whenever, it's your main question, I think, which is, how do we actually, get a solution for the 4 areas which are undecided? That's a different question, I think, from can we just give everything, tell the department where we are now, which is what effectively we're trying to say. But I completely agree with you.